Are you Santa? We haven't eaten in 3 days. Those words, whispered by a 6-year-old girl with sunken eyes, would haunt a drifting cowboy forever. But this isn't a Christmas miracle. This is high summer in 1887, where the sun kills as surely as any bullet, and a widow stands between her starving children and men who've decided her land is worth more than her life. What happens when a stranger rides into hell, not to save anyone, but to settle his own debts? Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The heat came first. Not the pleasant warmth of spring that coaxed green shoots from dark earth, but the punishing, relentless fury of a summer that had forgotten mercy. It rose before dawn, shimmering across the Oklahoma Territory in waves that bent the horizon and turned the air itself into something thick and hostile. By mid-morning, it pressed down on the Carter Ranch like an iron hand, squeezing moisture from the soil, cracking the earth into geometric patterns of surrender, bleaching the color from everything until the world existed only in shades of dust and desperation. Evelyn Carter stood on the porch of her farmhouse, her hand shading eyes that had long ago stopped expecting relief. 32 years old, though the frontier had a way of adding decades to a woman's face that no mirror could accurately measure. Her dark hair, once thick and lustrous, now hung in a loose braid down her back, threaded with gray that hadn't been there 2 years ago. Her dress, faded calico that had been mended so many times the original fabric was more memory than reality, hung loose on a frame that had shed 20 pounds since her husband disappeared. Disappeared. That was the word people used, as if Thomas Carter had simply wandered off one day and forgotten to come home, as if men didn't vanish in the territory for reasons that had nothing to do with forgetfulness and everything to do with power, land, and the kind of violence that left no witnesses. The ranch stretched before her like a dying patient, 40 acres that had once held promise, now reduced to a monument of failure. The corn that should have been waist-high stood stunted and brown, leaves curled inward like arthritic fingers. The vegetable garden that had fed them through previous winters was nothing but a rectangle of cracked earth decorated with the skeletal remains of tomato plants. Even the tough prairie grass that covered most of the property had given up, retreating to scattered yellow patches that crunched underfoot like old paper. The barn leaned slightly to the east, its red paint long since surrendered to the sun, exposing gray wood beneath like bones through torn skin. They'd lost the milk cow in April, just laid down one morning and didn't get up, as if she'd simply decided existence required more effort than she could spare. The chickens had stopped laying weeks ago, their energy devoted entirely to survival rather than production. 2 horses remained in the corral, their ribs visible beneath dull coats, standing head to tail in the minimal shade provided by a cottonwood tree that itself looked ready to quit. "Mama?" Evelyn turned. Lucas stood in the doorway, 11 years old and trying so hard to be the man of the house that it broke her heart daily. His face was all angles now, the roundness of childhood carved away by insufficient meals. His shirt, one of his father's cut down and re-sewn, hung on him like a flag on a windless day. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Mia's asking about supper." Evelyn felt something twist in her chest. "Tell her we'll eat when the sun goes down. It's too hot now anyway." It wasn't too hot. She was stalling. The truth was that supper would consist of the last of the flour mixed with water and fried, into something between a pancake and a lie. Maybe some wild onions if Lucas could find any that hadn't withered. The barrel in the kitchen that should have held salt pork was empty. The root cellar that should have contained potatoes, carrots, turnips, provisions to carry a family through hard times, echoed with nothing but dirt and hope's corpse. 3 days. They'd been rationing for weeks, but the last 3 days had been different. That was when Evelyn had stopped pretending they were just being careful and admitted to herself what she couldn't yet say aloud. They were starving. Not the dramatic starvation of stories where people collapsed in the street. This was the slow kind, the grinding kind, where you woke up weaker than the day before and your children's laughter became a memory because laughter required energy they couldn't spare. Where you found yourself staring at the horses and thinking thoughts that shamed you. Where every decision, whether to use water to wash a plate or save it for drinking, became a calculation of survival. "Mama?" Lucas's voice was quieter now. Is someone coming? Evelyn's head snapped up. She followed her son's pointing finger to the eastern boundary of their property, where the trail from town cut through the prairie like a scar. At first, she saw nothing but heat, shimmer, and distance. Then the shimmer resolved into something solid, a rider, moving slowly, leading a pack horse behind him. Her hand instinctively went to the doorframe where Thomas's rifle should have been. But the rifle had been sold 4 months ago, along with her wedding ring, her mother's silver brush, and every other item of value the ranch had possessed. All of it fed into the insatiable maw of debt that J.T. Hollister held over her head like an executioner's blade. "Get inside," she told Lucas. "Take your sister to the back room and stay there until I call you." "Mama." "Now, Lucas." She heard him move, heard his feet on the plank floor, heard the soft sound of Mia asking questions in that high, thin voice that had lost its music. 6 years old and already learning that the world was a place that took more than it gave. Evelyn descended the porch steps, her legs steadier than she felt. She positioned herself in the yard, equidistant between the house and the approaching rider, her body language making clear that this was as far as any stranger was getting without invitation. The rider emerged from the heat waves like something conjured, a tall man on a pale horse that might have been white once but now wore the dust of hard miles like a second coat. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a dark shirt despite the heat, and a duster that had seen better years. A bedroll was tied behind his saddle, saddlebags hung heavy on either side, and the pack horse behind him carried supplies that spoke of a man who'd been traveling rough for a while. He stopped 10 yards from where she stood and sat there for a long moment, neither threatening nor friendly, just present. Then he reached up with both hands, slowly, deliberately, and pushed his hat back. The face that emerged was younger than she'd expected, probably not yet 40, with the kind of weathered quality that came from years in the sun rather than decades in life. Strong jaw darkened by several days of beard, nose that had been broken at least once, eyes that were startling in their directness, gray or maybe blue, hard to tell in the harsh light, but clear and assessing in a way that made her straighten her spine. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance despite its quietness. "Name's Caleb Ward. I'm looking for work." Of all the things Evelyn had expected, demands for payment, warnings from Hollister's men, maybe even an outlaw looking for an easy mark, this wasn't it. She almost laughed. Almost. "You're looking for work," she repeated, her voice flat. "Yes, ma'am." "On this ranch." "If you're hiring." Now she did laugh, a short, bitter sound that surprised her with its harshness. "Mr. Ward, I appreciate the joke, but no joke, ma'am." He shifted slightly in the saddle, leather creaking. "Been riding since dawn. Saw your property from the ridge. Noticed some things that need fixing." "What you noticed," Evelyn said, hearing her voice rise despite her effort to control it, "is a dying ranch that can't pay you, can't feed you, can barely keep its own family from—" She stopped, swallowed, forced her voice back to level ground. "I think you'd better keep riding, Mr. Ward." He sat there, still as stone, for a long moment. Then he said, "Your well pump's running dry." She blinked. "What?" "Your well pump. The mechanism's probably clogged with sediment. Happens in drought when the water table drops. You're not out of water, you just can't reach it." He gestured toward the fence line. "And those posts along your eastern boundary are rotted at the base. Another good wind, and they'll go down. Take the whole fence with them." Evelyn felt something dangerous stirring in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. She crushed it immediately. "Mr. Ward, even if what you're saying is true, and I have no way to verify it, I can't pay you. Do you understand? I have no money. I have no food to spare. I have nothing to offer a hired hand except the same slow death my family is facing." "Not asking for money," he said. "Then what are you asking for?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling sense that he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal, the desperation poorly hidden, the fear running beneath her pride like an underground river. "Shade," he said finally. "Water from that well once I get it working. Maybe whatever supper you can spare, though I've got supplies for a while. I'll fix what needs fixing, do what needs doing, and when the work's done or you want me gone, I'll move on." "Why?" The question came out sharper than she intended. "Nobody works for nothing, Mr. Ward. What do you really want? Something crossed his face, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. Pain, maybe, or memory, wearing pain's clothing. Let's just say I owe a debt, he said quietly, and I'm looking to pay it forward. They stood there in the terrible heat, stranger and desperate woman, weighing options neither of them wanted. Evelyn knew she should send him away, knew that accepting help from an unknown man was dangerous, that inviting a stranger onto her failing ranch with her children and no husband and no means of defense was the kind of decision that got women killed in the territory stories people whispered about. But she also knew that the well pump had been giving them less water each day, knew that she'd been avoiding looking at the eastern fence because she couldn't bear to add one more failure to the list, knew that Lucas was growing weaker, that Mia had stopped asking when Papa was coming home, that they had maybe a week before decisions would be made for them by bodies that simply stopped working. The barn needs mucking, she heard herself say. Hasn't been done properly in months. And the roof on the chicken coop is coming loose. And there's a section of the house's foundation where the mortar's crumbling. Yes, ma'am. And I meant what I said about food. We're rationing. You'll get a share, but it won't be much. Won't be enough. I understand. And if I tell you to leave, for any reason, at any time, you leave. No questions, no arguments. Fair enough. Evelyn took a breath, released it, made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. You can put your horses in the corral. There's space in the barn for you to bed down. She paused, trying to remember the protocols of employment she hadn't thought about in months. I'll show you where things are. Caleb Ward nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and dismounted in a smooth motion that spoke of decades in the saddle. He was taller than she'd thought, maybe 6'2", with the lean build of a man who'd worked hard and eaten light for most of his life. As he led his horses toward the corral, Evelyn turned back to the house and found both her children pressed against the window, their faces pale circles in the dim interior. She forced something resembling a smile and gestured for them to come out. Lucas emerged first, positioning himself slightly in front of his sister in a gesture of protection that was both heartbreaking and futile. Mia peered around him, her enormous eyes, so like her father's, fixed on the stranger who was unsaddling his horse with economical movements. Is he going to help us, Mama? Mia whispered. He's going to try, sweetheart. Is he good or bad? It was the question of the age, wasn't it? The territory was full of men who were one thing one day and another the next, where circumstances turned shepherds into wolves, and wolves sometimes, occasionally, remembered how to be something resembling human. I don't know yet, Evelyn said honestly, but we're going to be careful and we're going to be smart, and if anything feels wrong, you tell me immediately. Understand? Both children nodded. They watched Caleb Ward work, removing saddles, checking hooves, speaking softly to the horses in words they couldn't hear. He moved with the kind of quiet competence that came from a lifetime of practice, every gesture purposeful, nothing wasted. When he was done, he retrieved something from his saddlebags and walked toward them. Evelyn felt her muscles tense, felt Lucas shift his weight, felt Mia's small hand find hers. Caleb stopped a respectful distance away and held out his hand. In it was a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Got some jerky here, he said, and hardtack. Not much, but it keeps. Figured the children might be hungry. Evelyn stared at the offered food. Her pride wanted to refuse it. Her maternal instinct wanted to snatch it from his hand and run. The compromise between those two impulses left her paralyzed. It was Mia who broke the stalemate. Are you Santa? She asked in that solemn, serious voice children used for important questions. Caleb blinked. Then, to Evelyn's surprise, he knelt. Actually got down on one knee in the dust and heat, so he was at Mia's eye level. No, little miss, he said gently. I'm just a cowboy. But I heard you might be in need of some help, and I happened to be passing through. We haven't eaten in 3 days, Mia said with the devastating honesty of children who haven't yet learned that some truths are supposed to stay hidden. Not really eaten. Mama tries, but she's sad because the cupboards are empty and the mean man from town wants to take our house. Mia, Evelyn started, mortification flooding through her, but Caleb just nodded, as if Mia had shared nothing more shocking than the color of the sky. That does sound like a situation that needs addressing, he said. He held out the bundle of food. Why don't you and your brother share this, and I'll see what I can do about those other problems. Fair? Mia looked at her mother. Evelyn wanted to refuse, wanted to insist they didn't need charity, but she was looking at her daughter's thin face and her son's desperate eyes, and suddenly pride seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. She nodded. Mia took the food with the reverence most children reserved for Christmas presents, and Lucas helped her unwrap it. The jerky was good quality, venison by the look of it, and there was more hardtack than Evelyn had seen in months. "Thank you," she managed, the words scraping her throat. We'll pay you back. Somehow." "No need," Caleb said, rising to his feet. "Just part of the arrangement. Now, if you'll show me where your tools are kept, I'll get started on that well pump before the day gets any hotter." The day was already a furnace, but Evelyn didn't argue. She led him to the barn, a journey of 30 yards that felt like miles under the weight of her children's hungry eyes and her own complicated gratitude. The barn's interior was marginally cooler, though the smell of old hay and animal absence was thick. Thomas's tools hung on the far wall, organized with the precision of a man who'd believed in the power of order even when chaos was winning. Hammer, saw, plane, awls, files, the bits and pieces of frontier maintenance that separated survival from surrender. "Your husband?" Caleb asked, and there was no pity in his voice, just acknowledgement. "Yes." "Recent?" 18 months. The lie came automatically. It had been 18 months since Thomas had disappeared. How long since she'd actually had a husband, a partner, a presence, something more than an absence wearing his clothes? That was harder to calculate. Caleb selected a wrench, examined it, nodded. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Are you?" The words came out harder than she intended. "You don't know me. Don't know him. Don't know if he was worth mourning." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw recognition in his eyes. Not of her specifically, but of something, some flavor of grief or anger or the complicated mixture of both that accompanied loss that wasn't clean. "No," he said. "I don't know any of that, but I know what it looks like when someone's been left to hold things together alone, and I know it's not fair, and I know sorry doesn't fix anything, but it's still true." Evelyn felt something crack in her chest, some wall she'd been maintaining through sheer will. She turned away before he could see her face. "The pump's on the north side of the house," she said, her voice rough. "You'll need a bucket for the sediment." "Yes, ma'am." He left, tools in hand, and Evelyn stood alone in the barn's dusty dimness, listening to her children outside sharing jerky like it was a feast, listening to the creak of the pump handle as Caleb Ward began working on a problem she'd thought was unsolvable. 3 days without real food, 18 months without a husband, 2 years of slow failure dressed up as perseverance, and now a stranger with gray eyes and a mysterious debt, working on her dying ranch for nothing but shade and water. Evelyn Carter didn't believe in miracles. The frontier had beaten that particular delusion out of her, but as she heard the first splash of water, actual water, hitting the bucket, heard Mia's delighted laugh, felt the barn shadows cool her sunburned skin, she allowed herself the dangerous indulgence of possibility. Maybe not a miracle, but maybe, just maybe, not the end. Not yet. The afternoon stretched long and brutal. The sun reached its apex and seemed to park there, as if the universe itself had decided that this particular day in July would serve as a test of endurance for anyone foolish enough to be alive in the Oklahoma Territory. Evelyn went through the motions of daily survival, checking on the chickens, still not laying, examining the stunted garden, still dying, trying to plan a supper from ingredients that existed more in memory than reality. But her attention kept drifting to the north side of the house, where Caleb Ward worked with the kind of steady persistence that reminded her painfully of Thomas in the early days, before the territory had broken something fundamental in him. The pump was old. Thomas had bought it used from a family moving back east, part of the constant churn of settlers who arrived full of hope and left full of something harder to name. It had worked well for 3 years, then adequately for 1 more, then progressively worse until the last few weeks when it seemed determined to surrender entirely. Evelyn had tried to fix it herself, of course, had taken it apart as much as she dared, cleaned what she could reach, said prayers to a God she wasn't sure was listening. But whatever was wrong existed beyond her limited understanding of mechanics, buried in the mysterious intersection of metal and water and the earth's grudging mercy. She found reasons to walk past, carrying wash water that didn't need carrying, checking on the children who didn't need checking. Each time she found Caleb Ward doing something different. Dismantling the pump housing, clearing the intake pipe with a length of wire he'd fashioned from God knows what, running rope down into the well itself, measuring depth, calculating things she couldn't begin to guess. He worked without speaking, without seeming to notice her observation, his focus absolute. Sweat darkened his shirt, made his hair curl at his neck, drew lines down his face that he wiped away absently with a kerchief that had gone from red to brown with dust. It was late afternoon when things changed. Evelyn was in the kitchen, teaching Mia how to make flour cakes with the precious little they had left, when Lucas burst through the door with an energy she hadn't seen in weeks. "Mama, Mama, it's working! The pump! There's so much water!" She dropped the wooden spoon, not bothering to wipe the flour from her hands, and followed her son outside at a pace just shy of running. The sight that greeted her stopped her in her tracks. Water. Actual water, not the muddy trickle that had become their norm, but clear water, pouring from the pump spout with a force that seemed impossible. It filled the trough Caleb had positioned beneath it, spilling over in streams that caught the late sun and turned it into something that looked like liquid gold. Caleb stood back, his hand still on the pump handle, watching the flow with the critical eye of a man assessing his work. When he saw her, he nodded. Sediment built up in the intake, like I thought. Plus, the leather gasket had dried out and cracked, not sealing properly. Fashioned a new one from spare tack leather. He released the handle, and the water continued flowing from momentum before settling to a manageable stream. You'll want to pump it for a good 10 minutes every day, clear out any sediment before it builds up again. And keep the gasket oiled. Lard works if you've got it. Evelyn couldn't speak. She was staring at the water, abundant, clear water, the way a person might stare at a resurrection. "Mama, can we?" Lucas was looking at the water with desperate longing. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and both children descended on the trough like penitents to a holy site. They cupped their hands and drank, splashed their faces, laughed with a sound she'd almost forgotten they could make. Mia dunked her whole head under, came up sputtering and grinning, her hair plastered to her skull, and her dress soaked and her face transformed by simple, profound joy. "Easy," Caleb said gently. "Don't drink too fast after going without. Small sips, let your body adjust." Lucas nodded seriously, slowing his gulps, and Mia imitated her brother with the unconscious mimicry of younger siblings everywhere. Evelyn approached the trough like it might vanish if she moved too quickly. She bent, cupped her hands, lifted water that was cold from the earth's depths, and drank. It tasted like minerals and possibility and the first breath after drowning. "How?" she asked when she could speak. "How did you know?" Caleb was coiling the rope he'd used, his movements methodical. "Seen it before. Drought drops the water table, pump has to work harder, sediment gets pulled up. Usually fixable if you know what you're looking for." "I tried to fix it." "I'm sure you did, ma'am, but some things need specific tools, specific knowledge. Doesn't mean you failed, means you needed help you didn't have." The words were matter-of-fact, empty of judgment, and somehow that made them harder to hear. How much of the last 6 months had been Evelyn trying to fix things she didn't have the knowledge or tools for? How much had been perseverance, and how much had been pride wearing perseverance's clothing? "Thank you," she said, and this time the words came easier, felt less like surrender, and more like simple truth. "Welcome to do the same for those fence posts tomorrow, if that suits you." "Mr. Ward." "Caleb's fine, ma'am." "Caleb." The name felt strange in her mouth, too informal, too friendly for a man she'd known for 3 hours. "Why are you really here?" He finished coiling the rope, tied it off, straightened. When he looked at her, his eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's labor. "I told you. You told me you owe a debt. That's not an answer. That's a deflection." She crossed her arms, aware she was pushing but unable to stop herself. Men don't ride onto failing ranches offering free labor out of simple charity. They don't have the skills you have and live the life you're clearly living. So I'll ask again, why are you here? For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he looked past her toward the western horizon, where the sun was beginning its slow descent, and said, I had a family once. Ranch in Texas. Not much bigger than this. Wife named Sarah. Daughter named Beth. She'd be about your girl's age now if... He stopped. Started again. There was a drought. Bad one. I hired on with a cattle drive, thought I could make enough to tide us through, buy seed for the next season. Told myself it was the smart thing, the responsible thing. Told myself they'd be fine for 2 months while I was gone. Evelyn felt ice forming in her stomach despite the heat. There was a fire, Caleb continued, his voice flat in the way of people reciting facts they'd repeated too many times. Started in the barn, spread to the house. By the time neighbors got there, he stopped again. They said Sarah tried to go back in for Beth. They said she almost made it out. Oh, God, Evelyn whispered. So when I see a ranch failing, a family struggling, a woman trying to hold things together alone. He looked at her then, and the pain in his eyes was old and raw and bottomless. I stop. I help. I do what I should have done 3 years ago. I stay instead of leaving. That wasn't your fault, Evelyn said automatically. Wasn't it? His smile was terrible. I chose to leave, chose to believe everything would be fine, chose wrong, and they paid the price. So now I make different choices. I stop running. I help where I'm needed. And maybe, somewhere down the line, the ledger gets a little more balanced. That's not how... I know, he interrupted. I know it doesn't work that way. Know that helping your family doesn't bring back mine. Know that no amount of fence mending or pump fixing will change what happened. But it's what I've got, Mrs. Carter. It's the only currency I have left to spend. They stood there in the lowering light, two people carrying grief in different shapes, and Evelyn understood with sudden clarity that she'd been wrong about miracles. They didn't exist, at least not the kind that erased pain or rewound time or made the dead undead. But sometimes broken people helped other broken people stay upright a little longer. Sometimes that had to be enough. Evelyn, she said quietly. Ma'am? My name is Evelyn. If you're going to be working here, staying here, you should use it. He nodded slowly. Evelyn, then. And for what it's worth, Caleb Ward, I'm sorry for your loss too. I'm sorry the world took your family. I'm sorry you carry that, and She paused, choosing words carefully. I'm grateful you're here, even if the reasons are complicated. Most things worth doing are complicated. Yes, she agreed. They are. Lucas and Mia had finished playing in the water and were now sitting in the trough's overflow, making mud structures with the dedication of engineers. Their laughter floated across the yard, strange and precious and almost painful in its normalcy. About supper, Evelyn said, pulling herself back to practical matters. I wasn't exaggerating about our stores, but there's wild onions down by the creek bed, and if you're willing to try, sometimes there's catfish in the deeper pools. With what you provided earlier and what I have, we could make something resembling a meal. I've got a fishing line, Caleb said, and I'm not above hunting onions. I'll come with you. The children can stay here. They'll be visible from the creek, and they know not to wander. You don't need to... I know my land better than you do, she said firmly. And I'm not so far gone that I'm comfortable sending a stranger off alone with directions to my water source. No offense. None taken. That's smart thinking. They collected Lucas and Mia from their mud architecture, gave them instructions about staying in sight of the house, and set off toward the creek that marked the southern boundary of the property. It was less than a quarter mile, but the walk felt longer in the heat, even with the sun dipping lower. The creek was less than its name suggested. More a memory of water than actual water, reduced to scattered pools separated by stretches of damp rock. But it was still cooler here, shaded by cottonwoods that had survived by virtue of deep roots and stubborn persistence. There, Evelyn said, pointing to a cluster of green shoots. The onions. They're small, but they're there. And that pool, she indicated a depression where water had collected, perhaps 3 feet across and twice that deep. Thomas caught catfish there last summer. They hide under the overhang. Caleb knelt by the pool, studying it with the focus of a man who'd learned to read water like other people read books. He reached into his pocket and produced a length of line wrapped around a small piece of wood, already rigged with a hook fashioned from a bent nail. "Need bait," he said. "Dig near the onions. If the soil's damp enough, there might be worms." They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes. Evelyn gathering onions, Caleb excavating worms with a flat rock. The heat was still oppressive, but here by the water, with the trees providing broken shade, it felt almost bearable. "Your husband," Caleb said suddenly. "You said he disappeared, not died." Evelyn's hand stilled on an onion. "Yes." "Those are different things." "Yes," she said again. "Want to tell me about it?" Did she? The story had been locked inside her for so long, shared with no one because the town people had their own theories and didn't need her contribution. But something about the day, the water, the food, the strange intimacy of shared grief, loosened the lock. "Thomas Carter was a good man," she said slowly, pulling another onion and dropping it in the cloth bag she'd brought. "Not perfect. Had a temper sometimes, especially when things weren't going well. Drank more than he should. But he loved us. Loved this land. Believed in the promise of it, you know? That if we just worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, we could build something lasting." "Lots of men believe that," Caleb observed, baiting his hook. "Yes, and lots of men learn different." She moved to another cluster of onions. "There's a man in town, J.T. Hollister. Owns the bank, the land office, half the businesses on Main Street. Came out from St. Louis 5 years ago with money and ambition and the kind of smile that makes you check your pockets after shaking his hand. I know the type." Hollister started buying up land, not directly, but through shell companies, proxies, complicated arrangements. He'd offer loans to struggling ranchers, reasonable rates at first. Then when they couldn't pay, and the terms were structured so they couldn't pay, he'd foreclose. Except sometimes the ranchers would refuse to leave, or lawyer up, or make noise about unfair lending practices. "And then they'd have accidents," Caleb said quietly, "or disappear, or their barns would burn, or their cattle would sicken mysteriously." Evelyn's voice had gone cold. Thomas started noticing the pattern, started talking to other ranchers, comparing stories. He was going to take it to the territorial marshal, had evidence, statements, documentation. She stopped, her hands in the dirt, seeing Thomas as he'd been that last morning, excited, nervous, certain he was doing the right thing, kissing her goodbye, promising he'd be back by nightfall. "They found his horse 3 days later," she continued, "wandering loose, saddle still on, no sign of Thomas. The marshal did a search, half-hearted, everyone knew, and concluded Thomas must have been thrown, hit his head, wandered off, confused. They searched for a week, found nothing, declared it a tragic accident." "But you don't believe that." "I believe my husband was murdered," Evelyn said flatly. "I believe Hollister or his men killed him because he was going to expose a conspiracy. And I believe the reason they didn't make it look like an accident is because the message was more important than the cover-up. They wanted other ranchers to know. This is what happens when you fight back." Caleb cast his line into the pool, the weight carrying it to the shadowed depths. "And now Hollister wants your land. Has wanted it since before Thomas disappeared. We borrowed from his bank to expand the ranch, buy equipment. Terms seemed reasonable at the time, but there were clauses about productivity requirements, property conditions, all kinds of technical language Thomas thought was standard. But wasn't. We defaulted 6 months ago. Hollister's been patient, publicly patient anyway. Sent representatives to check on me, offered to help by buying the land for pennies on the dollar. Last month his lawyer showed up with foreclosure papers. I've got until the end of August to pay the full debt or vacate." "How much is the debt?" $300. Caleb whistled low. It was an enormous sum for a failing ranch, more than most families saw in a year. "There's no way to raise it," Evelyn continued. "I've sold everything sellable. Even if the crops came in, which they won't, it wouldn't be enough. And if by some miracle I scraped together the money, Hollister would just find another clause I'd violated, another reason to take what he wants. He could just force you out now." "He could. But he's careful, Hollister. Likes to maintain the appearance of legitimacy. As long as I'm cooperating, playing along with the legal fiction, he doesn't need to get his hands dirty. It's only when people fight back that—" She stopped, realized what she'd just implied. That they end up like Thomas, Caleb finished. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, watching his line. Then he said, You ever think about leaving, taking the children somewhere else, starting over? Every day. The admission came easily, perhaps too easily. But where would we go? What would we do? I've got no money for travel, no family to take us in. And even if I did, she paused, surprised by the ferocity in her next words. This is my land, my home. Thomas is buried somewhere in this dirt, even if there's no marker to show it. I'll be damned if I let Hollister take it without a fight. Even if fighting means, I know what it means. She met his eyes. I know the stakes, Caleb. I'm not naive, but I'm also not leaving. Not while there's breath in my body and strength in my hands. Not while my children are watching to see if their mother is someone who stands or someone who runs. Caleb studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, something like respect crossing his face. Fair enough. His line twitched. He gave it a moment, then jerked. Not hard, just firm, and began pulling in. A catfish emerged, small but viable, thrashing in the fading light. Supper, he said simply. They caught 2 more before full dark threatened, gathered their onions, and walked back toward the house. The children had moved to the porch, sitting close together, and Evelyn felt a pang seeing how they'd positioned themselves, able to see the direction their mother had gone, ready to call or run if needed. This was what the territory did to children, she thought, made them cautious, made them old before their time, made them understand that mothers sometimes didn't come back. Look, Mia called out, pointing at the fish. We're going to have real food. Real food, Evelyn confirmed, unable to help her smile. Lucas, get the good pan, the cast iron. Mia, fetch the salt from the cupboard and be careful with it. The children scrambled to help, their energy renewed by the promise of an actual meal. Caleb cleaned the fish with quick efficiency while Evelyn got the stove going. Precious wood, carefully rationed, but some occasions warranted the expense. As she worked, measuring flour for coating, chopping onions, rationing the last of their lard, she was intensely aware of Caleb's presence in her kitchen. It had been 18 months since a man stood here, since male hands helped with domestic tasks, since the space felt like something shared rather than something defended. It should have felt invasive. Instead, it felt like memory made manifest, not of Thomas specifically, but of the idea of partnership, of shared burden, of 2 people working toward a common purpose. Dangerous thinking, she warned herself. Caleb Ward was passing through, paying a debt that wasn't really his to pay. This wasn't permanence. This wasn't salvation. This was a moment, and moments ended. But as she laid fish in hot oil, as the smell of actual cooking food filled the kitchen, as her children sat at the table with eyes wide and mouths already watering, as Caleb Ward sat at the 4th chair that had been empty for too long, as all these things happened simultaneously, Evelyn allowed herself to pretend, just for this one evening, that maybe the story wasn't over, that maybe, against all odds and logic, there was still another chapter to be written. The fish lasted 2 meals, dinner that night and breakfast the next morning, stretched with the onions and what remained of the flour. It wasn't abundance, but it was enough to quiet the hollow ache in their stomachs, enough to let the children sleep without the whimpering sounds that had become routine, enough to give Evelyn the strength to face another day without feeling like she was moving through water. Caleb was up before dawn. She heard him from her bedroom, the creak of the barn door, the low murmur of his voice to the horses, the rhythmic sound of an axe biting into wood. By the time she'd dressed and gotten the children moving, he'd already split enough kindling to last them a week and was examining the eastern fence line with the intensity of a surgeon studying a patient. "Morning," she called, approaching with 2 cups of weak chicory coffee. Real coffee had become a memory months ago, but the ritual of morning cups remained. He straightened, accepted the cup with a nod of thanks. "Morning. Your son was right about these posts. 3 are completely rotted through at the base, another 4 are compromised. Wind's been holding them up more than any actual structural integrity." Evelyn looked at the fence, simple wooden posts and wire that marked where her property ended and the open range began. It had never seemed like much, just a line in the dirt declaring ownership. But out here, boundaries mattered. They were the difference between your cattle and someone else's, your land and disputed territory, your home and just another piece of prairie that belonged to whoever could claim it. Can they be fixed? Need to be replaced. I saw some decent timber down by the creek. Cottonwood. Not ideal, but it'll serve. We dig out the old posts, sink new ones. Should hold for a few years at least. That's a lot of work, he shrugged. Work's what I'm here for. They drank their coffee in the pre-dawn coolness, that brief window before the sun asserted its dominion. In the half-light, the ranch almost looked prosperous. Shadows hid the dying crops, the peeling paint, the accumulated evidence of slow failure. You could almost pretend it was 5 years ago, when Thomas had first claimed this land, when everything seemed possible. I'll need Lucas to help, Caleb said, breaking her reverie. If that sits right with you. Boy's old enough to learn, and an extra pair of hands makes the difference between finishing in 3 days versus 5. Evelyn's first instinct was to refuse. Lucas was still a child, still deserved whatever remained of childhood. But that was city thinking, soft thinking. Out here, 11-year-old boys worked beside their fathers, learned the skills that would keep them alive when those fathers were gone. Besides, Lucas needed this, needed to feel useful, needed to learn from a man who knew what he was doing, needed something other than watching his mother fail in slow motion. He'd like that, she said, but he tires easily. We all do. Don't push him past what he can manage. Wouldn't dream of it. Lucas, when told, lit up with an enthusiasm Evelyn hadn't seen in months. He wolfed down his breakfast, fried fish and the last scraping of the flour, and practically vibrated with eagerness as Caleb explained what they'd be doing. First rule of fence work, Caleb said, his tone taking on the quality of instruction, is that the ground tells you everything. You don't force a post into stubborn earth, you read what the earth is saying and adjust accordingly. Some soil wants a wider hole, some wants it deeper. Some needs rocks for bracing, some needs to be tamped down hard. You listening? Yes, sir, Lucas said, standing straighter. Good. Second rule. Measure twice, dig once. We sink these posts at the wrong depth or the wrong angle, we're doing the whole job over. So we're going to be slow, careful, and deliberate. Understand? Yes, sir. And third rule, most important one. When I say take a break, you take a break. Don't care if you think you can keep going. Heat and stubbornness kill more men out here than bandits and snakes combined. We work smart, not hard. Clear? Clear. Evelyn watched them head toward the creek, tools over their shoulders, and felt something complicated twist in her chest. It looked right, that image. Man and boy, working together, the natural order of how things should be. It also felt like betrayal somehow, as if Lucas learning from someone other than Thomas was erasing his father, replacing him with this stranger who'd arrived out of the dust and heat. She shook off the thought. Thomas was gone. Gone in the ground or gone in whatever shallow grave Hollister's men had dug, and either way, Lucas needed guidance she couldn't provide. Better to learn from a competent stranger than to fumble along ignorant. Mia appeared at her elbow, slipping her small hand into Evelyn's. Is Mr. Caleb going to stay forever? I don't know, sweetheart. Probably not forever. I like him. He doesn't look at us sad like the church ladies do. The church ladies mean well. They make me feel bad, though, like we're broken and they're sorry about it. Mia leaned against her mother's side. Mr. Caleb doesn't make me feel broken. He just fixes things. Out of the mouths of children, Evelyn thought. Leave it to a 6-year-old to articulate what she'd been circling around for a day and a half. The morning passed in work that had become routine, checking on chickens that still refused to lay, attempting to salvage vegetables that were mostly corpse, rationing water for the most critical plants, even though there was now enough to spare. The difference the working pump made was already evident. Having abundant water changed calculations, opened possibilities, allowed her to think beyond simple day-to-day survival. It was mid-morning when the rider came. Evelyn saw him from the garden, a dark figure on a dark horse, moving at the kind of leisurely pace that spoke of confidence rather than caution. Her stomach clenched. She recognized that horse. A big bay gelding, expensive, well-fed. There were only 3 horses like that in the territory, and all of them belonged to men who worked for J.T. Hollister. Mia, she said quietly, keeping her voice level, go inside, right now. Don't argue. Her daughter, sensing the shift in tone, obeyed immediately. Evelyn wiped the dirt from her hands, straightened her spine, and walked toward the house with measured steps. She arrived at the porch just as the rider did, positioning herself on the top step. Higher ground, small advantage, but she'd learned to take what she could get. The man who dismounted was Marcus Webb, Hollister's primary enforcer. 40 years old, over 6 feet, with the kind of lean muscle that came from hard living and harder choices. He wore a suit despite the heat, dark wool, probably expensive, and a gun belt with a Colt .45 that looked well-maintained and frequently used. "Mrs. Carter," he said, touching his hat brim in a mockery of respect. "Hot day." "Mr. Webb, what brings you out here?" "Just checking on you, ma'am. Mr. Hollister worries about a woman alone with children, all the way out here." "I'm managing." "Are you, though?" His eyes drifted across the ranch, cataloging failure with practiced ease. "Crops look poor. Heard you'd been having trouble with the well. That's unfortunate." "The well's fine now." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. "Is that so? Fixed it yourself, did you?" "Does it matter how it got fixed?" "Mr. Hollister takes an interest in the properties he has financial stake in. Likes to know what improvements are being made, who might be making them." Webb's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Wouldn't want you going further into debt, hiring help you can't afford." "I haven't gone into any debt, and my property management is my business." "Legally speaking, Mrs. Carter, your property management is very much Mr. Hollister's business. You're 3 months behind on your mortgage payments. The August deadline is approaching. We'd hate to see you lose everything because of poor planning." The threat was barely veiled. Evelyn forced her voice to stay steady. "I'm aware of my obligations, Mr. Webb. I'll meet them or I won't, but either way I don't need or want your employer's concern." "That's the thing about debt," Webb said, his tone conversational, but his eyes cold. "It doesn't care what you want. It just sits there, growing, waiting, and when the time comes to collect—" He shrugged. "Well, that's when things get difficult." "Is there a purpose to this visit, or are you just here to deliver veiled threats?" "No threats, ma'am. Just friendly concern from a man who'd hate to see a widow and her children out on the street with nowhere to go." He glanced toward the creek, where Caleb and Lucas were visible in the distance, working on the fence. "Who's that?" "Hired hand." "Funny. Heard you couldn't afford hired help." "I found a way." "Mr. Hollister will want to know about this. Might affect the terms of your debt if you've got resources you haven't disclosed." "The terms are the terms, Mr. Webb. Tell Mr. Hollister that I'm doing everything in my power to meet my obligations, and that his concern, while noted, is unnecessary." Webb studied her for a long moment, and Evelyn had the uncomfortable sense of being evaluated like livestock at auction. Then he smiled, a real smile this time, which was somehow worse than the false one. "You remind me of your husband, Mrs. Carter. Same stubborn streak, same belief that principles matter more than reality." He swung back into his saddle with easy grace. "Thomas learned different eventually. I'd hate for you to need the same lesson." He rode off at the same leisurely pace he'd arrived, and Evelyn stood frozen on the porch, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hands shaking with an anger she couldn't afford to indulge. She didn't move until Webb was completely out of sight. Then she sat down hard on the porch steps, wrapped her arms around her knees, and tried to control her breathing. That's when she noticed Caleb standing 20 feet away, a fence post over his shoulder, and Lucas beside him, both watching her with expressions that made it clear they'd seen the entire exchange. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked. "Long enough?" Caleb set the post down carefully. "Lucas, why don't you go check on your sister? Make sure she's all right." "But now, son." There was command in that voice, the kind that boys instinctively obeyed. Lucas went, glancing back over his shoulder with worried eyes. Caleb walked to the porch, sat down on the step below Evelyn. A deliberate choice, she noticed, putting himself at the lower position, and said, "Want to tell me who that was?" "Marcus Webb. Works for Hollister." "The man who wants your land?" "Yes." "He threaten you?" "Not directly. Webb's too smart for direct threats. He implies, suggests, reminds. Makes sure you know the score without saying anything you could repeat to a marshal." Caleb was quiet for a moment, his jaw working. Then he said, "Lucas told me something while we were working. Told me his father used to have nightmares toward the end. Used to wake up scared, talking about men watching the ranch, following him into town. Evelyn closed her eyes. Thomas was paranoid. The stress of the failing ranch. Was he paranoid or was he right? She didn't answer. Because what I just saw, Caleb continued, his voice low and intense, was a man marking territory. Making sure you know you're being watched. That's not debt collection, Evelyn. That's predator behavior. I know what it is. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you're a woman alone with 2 children on a piece of land that someone powerful wants. And the only thing standing between you and being forcibly removed is a legal fiction that expires in 6 weeks. That's not a situation you can just endure your way through. What exactly do you suggest I do? The words came out sharper than she intended. Fight? How? I have no money, no influence, no power. I can't hire lawyers, can't buy protection, can't even prove Thomas was murdered because there's no body, no evidence, just my certainty against Hollister's reputation. You could leave. We've had this conversation. That was before I saw Webb, before I understood exactly what you're up against. Caleb turned to face her fully. Evelyn, they're stubborn and they're suicidal. If Hollister wants this land badly enough to kill for it, and I think we both know he does, then staying here isn't bravery. It's a death sentence. Maybe. She met his eyes. But it's my choice to make. What about your children's choice? They get a vote in whether their mother martyrs herself for a patch of dirt? The words hit like a physical blow. She stood up, anger flooding through her in a hot rush. Don't you dare! Don't you dare come here, work for 2 days, and presume to lecture me about my children. You don't know them. Don't know me. Don't know what we've survived or what we're capable of surviving. You're right, Caleb said, standing as well, but keeping his voice level. I don't know. But I know what grief looks like, and I know what desperation looks like, and I know the difference between courage and slow suicide. And right now I'm looking at a woman choosing the latter while calling it the former. They stood there, both breathing hard, the heat pressing down like a judge's gavel. Somewhere in the house, Mia was singing to herself, a formless melody that drifted through the walls like smoke. I can't leave, Evelyn said finally, and hated how her voice cracked on the words. I can't. This is all I have, Caleb. All that's left of the life Thomas and I built. All that proves we existed, that we mattered. If I walk away, they win. Hollister wins. Thomas dies for nothing. And my children learn that their mother is someone who runs when things get hard. Or they learn their mother is someone who chooses them over pride. It's not about pride, isn't it? His voice was gentle now, which somehow made it worse. Evelyn, I'm not saying you shouldn't fight. I'm saying you need to fight smart. Staying here, waiting for August to come while Hollister tightens the noose. That's not fighting. That's just dying slow. She wanted to argue, wanted to defend her choices with the kind of righteous certainty she'd been clinging to for months. But somewhere in his words was a truth she'd been avoiding, that determination without strategy was just stubbornness wearing a noble mask. What would you do? She asked quietly. If you were me, what would you do? Caleb looked out toward the fence line, toward the work they'd started, toward the land that was worth dying for or worth nothing, depending on who was doing the valuing. I'd make noise, he said finally. Right now, Hollister's operating in shadows, using legal mechanisms and implied threats. He can do that because nobody's paying attention. But if someone started asking questions, loud questions, public questions, that changes the equation. Questions like what? Like how many ranchers have lost their land to Hollister's bank in the last 5 years? Like how many of those foreclosures involved unusual circumstances, fires, accidents, disappearances? Like whether the territorial marshal might be interested in reviewing some of those cases with fresh eyes. Thomas tried that. Look where it got him. Thomas tried it alone. Thomas was one rancher making accusations against a powerful man. But what if it wasn't just one rancher? What if it was 10, 20, all telling the same story? Caleb turned to face her. Hollister's power comes from isolation, keeping his victims separate, making sure they don't compare notes or coordinate resistance. But that isolation is also his weakness. Break it, and suddenly he's not fighting scattered individuals, he's fighting a unified front. Evelyn felt something spark in her chest. Not hope exactly, but possibility's distant cousin. You're talking about organizing the other ranchers. I'm talking about exposing a pattern of criminal behavior that's too big to ignore. Even a corrupt marshal can't dismiss 20 families all making the same accusations. It's dangerous. Anyone who joins that kind of effort becomes a target. They're already targets. They just don't know it yet. Caleb's expression hardened. That's how men like Hollister operate. They pick off the herd one at a time, and the rest convince themselves they'll be spared if they just keep their heads down. But the truth is, he'll come for all of them eventually. Might as well fight while there's still strength to fight with. It was a good plan, maybe even a viable plan, but it required something Evelyn wasn't sure she possessed anymore. The ability to trust, to reach out, to believe that other people might help rather than simply protect their own interests. The Johnsons, she said slowly. They lost their ranch last year, fire in the middle of winter, which makes no sense. They're living in town now, working odd jobs. That's one family. And the Mendozas, their water supply was poisoned. They claimed someone dumped something in their well, had to abandon the land, couldn't prove anything. Two families. The Pritchards, the O'Connells, the Swansons. Evelyn felt the list growing in her mind. Names and faces she'd seen in town, at church. People who'd stopped making eye contact because failure was contagious. There are probably a dozen families who've been pushed out in the last 3 years. Then we talk to them. We document what happened. We build a case that's too strong to ignore. We? She looked at him. You're talking like you're planning to stay. Caleb was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. Then he said, I told you I had a debt to pay. Maybe this is how I pay it. Not by helping one family, but by stopping the kind of man who creates families like yours, like mine. That's a lot to take on for a stranger. Maybe I'm tired of being a stranger. He met her eyes. Maybe I'm tired of drifting from ranch to ranch, fixing problems that keep repeating because the root cause never gets addressed. Maybe it's time to actually solve something instead of just putting temporary patches on permanent wounds. There was intensity in his voice, conviction that went beyond simple helpfulness. Evelyn recognized it because she'd felt it herself, that moment when endurance transformed into purpose, when surviving became insufficient and you needed to actually win. If we do this, she said carefully, if we start making noise, organizing people, building a case against Hollister, it won't be subtle. He'll know, and he'll respond. Yes, people could get hurt. People are already getting hurt. At least this way they'd be fighting back. My children would see their mother stand up instead of bow down. Caleb's voice softened. Evelyn, I'm not saying there's no risk. There's enormous risk. But the alternative is waiting for August, waiting for Hollister to take everything, waiting to become another story people whisper about. At least this way you're choosing the terms of the fight. She looked at the ranch, her ranch, Thomas's dream, her children's inheritance. Looked at the house they'd built, the barn Thomas had raised, the fence posts Caleb was replacing. Looked at all of it and tried to imagine walking away, tried to imagine Lucas and Mia growing up knowing their mother had surrendered without throwing a real punch. Couldn't do it, couldn't make that future feel acceptable. We'd need proof, she said. Not just stories, actual documentation. Loan papers, foreclosure notices, records of what families were promised versus what they got. Anything that shows a pattern of fraud or coercion. People keep papers. Even when they lose everything, they keep the papers that destroyed them. Human nature. We'd need someone to present it, someone who can't be easily dismissed or intimidated. A lawyer, maybe, or a territorial representative. Someone with standing and authority. Those cost money. Then we find money, pool resources, call in favors, make it work somehow. Caleb's eyes were bright now, strategic mind engaged. First step is gathering the families, hearing their stories, seeing what we've got to work with. Can you make a list of names, people who might be willing to talk? I can try. But Caleb, these are scared people, defeated people. Convincing them to stand up against the man who destroyed them, that's not going to be easy. Nothing worth doing is easy. You taught me that. I didn't teach you anything. You taught me what it looks like when someone refuses to quit, even when quitting is the smart choice. You taught me that sometimes stubbornness is another word for strength. He smiled slightly. Now, I'm just suggesting we point that strength in a useful direction. Evelyn found herself smiling back despite everything. You're either very brave or very stupid. Can it be both? Usually is. They stood there on the porch, the heat pressing down, the impossible task stretching before them like an unbridged canyon. But for the first time in 18 months, Evelyn felt something other than despair. Not hope. She wasn't ready for that word yet. But possibility, maybe. The sense that endings weren't inevitable, that stories could have different conclusions than the ones powerful men wrote. "Lucas!" she called. "Come get some water. We've got planning to do." Her son emerged from the house, Mia trailing behind him, both children sensing the shift in atmosphere, even if they didn't understand its source. They gathered around the pump that worked now because a stranger had known how to fix it, and drank cold water from the earth's deep places. "Mr. Caleb's going to be staying a while longer," Evelyn told them, and watched their faces light up with uncomplicated joy. "We've got work to do, important work. Are you two ready to help?" "Yes, Mama," they chorused. "Good, because things are going to get hard before they get better, but we're not alone anymore. We've got help, we've got a plan, and we're going to fight." "Fight who?" Mia asked. "The bad men," Lucas said with the certainty of childhood understanding of moral absolutes. "The ones who hurt Papa." Evelyn looked at Caleb, who nodded slightly. Permission, encouragement, solidarity. "Yes," she said. "The ones who hurt Papa, and we're going to make sure they can't hurt anyone else." The children cheered, treating it like a game, because they were young enough that justice and vengeance and legal battles were abstractions that existed in the safe distance of adult concerns. But Evelyn knew better, knew that what they were planning was dangerous, knew that Hollister wouldn't accept challenges to his power, knew that before this was over, there would be blood and fire and choices that couldn't be unmade. But she also knew that for the first time since Thomas's horse had come home riderless, she wasn't facing those things alone. The stranger who'd ridden out of the summer heat had become something else. Not family. Not yet. Maybe never. But ally. Partner. The kind of help that didn't come with pity or expectations, just competence and commitment, and a debt he was determined to pay. That evening, they ate together again. Beans Caleb had brought from his supplies, cornbread Evelyn made with the last of a neighbor's gift flour, water that tasted like triumph because it came from a pump that worked. Lucas talked about fence posts and proper digging technique with the enthusiasm of a new convert. Mia fell asleep at the table, her head pillowed on her arms, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been for weeks. And Evelyn sat across from Caleb Ward and began making lists in her head. Names of families, locations of documents, arguments that might convince scared people to become brave ones. The task was enormous. The odds were terrible. But the alternative was surrender. And that word wasn't in her vocabulary anymore. Outside, the sun finally released its stranglehold on the day, and the temperature dropped from unbearable to merely oppressive. Nightbirds called across the prairie. The horses in the corral moved restlessly, sensing storms that might be coming or might be wishful thinking. And on the eastern boundary of the Carter Ranch, new fence posts stood straight and strong, marking territory that someone had decided was worth defending. The fight hadn't started yet, but the army was beginning to form, and in the morning they would begin recruiting soldiers. The first family they approached was the Johnsons. Evelyn and Caleb rode into town 3 days after Webb's visit, leaving Lucas and Mia with their nearest neighbor, a widow named Mrs. Patterson who'd lost her own husband to consumption and understood what it meant to carry on alone. The children had protested being left behind, but Evelyn had been firm. What they were doing required adult conversations about adult violence, and some things children shouldn't witness, even brave ones. Town was a generous word for what amounted to a single main street with wooden buildings leaning against each other like tired dancers. General store, saloon, land office, bank, Hollister's bank, its false front painted white to suggest purity it didn't possess. A few houses scattered on the outskirts, a church with a steeple that listed slightly to the north, and everywhere the dust that seemed to be the territory's primary export. They found Robert Johnson behind the livery stable, mucking out stalls for 50 cents a day, and whatever dignity he could salvage from the wreckage of his life. He was 45 but looked 60, his face carved into hard lines by disappointment and physical labor that broke bodies faster than it built them. "Mrs. Carter," he said when he saw them, surprise and something like shame crossing his features. "Didn't expect to see you in town." "Mr. Johnson, this is Caleb Ward. He's helping out at my ranch. We'd like to talk with you if you have a few minutes." Johnson glanced around nervously, as if the walls had ears. They probably did, Evelyn thought. In a town this size, information traveled faster than disease and was just as contagious. "Talk about what?" "About what happened to your ranch. About Hollister." The name landed like a stone in still water. Johnson's face closed up immediately, his body language shifting from open to defensive in the space of a breath. "Got nothing to say about that. Lost the ranch fair and square, that's all. Bad luck with the fire, worse luck with the bank. These things happen." "Mr. Johnson," "I said I got nothing to say, Mrs. Carter. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got work to do." He turned back to his mucking, dismissing them with the kind of finality that brooked no argument. But Caleb didn't move, just stood there watching Johnson work, and after a moment said quietly, "Your barn burned in January, middle of winter. Temperature was below freezing that week." Johnson's shovel paused mid-stroke. "Fires don't usually start spontaneously in freezing weather," Caleb continued, "especially not in barns where everything's cold and damp. Someone would have to be careless, leave a lantern burning, maybe. Or someone would have to be deliberate." "You calling me careless?" Johnson's voice was tight. "I'm saying fires have causes, and sometimes those causes are men with matches and grudges." Johnson set down the shovel, his shoulders slumping. When he turned, his eyes were haunted. "You know what happens to people who make accusations they can't prove? They end up like Thomas Carter. They disappear, or they watch their families suffer, or both." "That's why we need multiple voices," Evelyn said. "Not just one person making accusations, but many, a pattern that can't be dismissed or silenced." "You're talking about organizing against Hollister," Johnson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's suicide, Mrs. Carter. The man owns this town, owns the marshal, owns the land office. You go up against him, you're not fighting one man, you're fighting a machine." "Then we build a bigger machine," Caleb said. "We document everything. We get testimony from every family he's destroyed. We take it to the territorial governor, to federal marshals, to newspapers in the big cities. We make it too loud to ignore. And in the meantime, while you're building this case, what do you think Hollister's doing? Sitting quietly?" Johnson shook his head. "He'll come after you, come after everyone involved. Make examples that'll keep people quiet for the next decade." "He's already coming after me," Evelyn said. "I've got 6 weeks before foreclosure. 6 weeks before I lose everything Thomas and I built. So I can spend those 6 weeks waiting to die, or I can spend them fighting. I'd rather fight." Something flickered in Johnson's eyes. Recognition, maybe, or memory of who he'd been before fear had hollowed him out. "What would you need from me?" "Your story. The truth of what happened. Documentation if you have it. Loan papers, insurance claims, anything that shows the fire was suspicious or that the bank's seizure was irregular." "I kept the papers," Johnson said slowly. "My wife wanted to burn them, said they were just reminders of failure. But I kept them. Don't know why, except—" He trailed off. "Except some part of you knew you'd need them someday," Caleb finished. Yeah, maybe." They talked for another 20 minutes, Johnson gradually opening up, the story spilling out in fragments that Evelyn pieced together into a horrifying whole. The fire had started while the family was at church. Convenient timing, that. The insurance company had refused to pay, citing some clause about negligent maintenance. The bank had accelerated the loan, demanding full payment within 30 days, an impossible deadline. And through it all, Hollister's men had been there, helpful and sympathetic and always ready with an offer to buy the land for a fraction of its value. "He never gets his hands dirty," Johnson said bitterly. "It's always proxies, intermediaries, legal mechanisms. You can see his fingerprints all over it, but proving it in a court of law, that's another matter entirely." "That's why we need volume," Evelyn said. "1 case is an anomaly. 10 cases is a pattern. 20 cases is a conspiracy." Johnson agreed to help, though the fear never left his eyes. He gave them names of other families, locations where they might be found, warnings about who to avoid because they'd been too broken or bought off to be reliable. The Mendoza family was next, living in a one-room shack on the edge of town, taking in laundry to survive. Maria Mendoza listened to their pitch with the hardened skepticism of someone who'd learned that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. But her husband Carlos had fire left in his eyes. "We lost everything because someone poisoned our well," he said, his accent thick but his English clear. "Livestock died first, then the children got sick. We couldn't prove it was deliberate, but what else makes sense? Water was fine for 3 years, then suddenly it's killing everything that drinks it?" "Did you have it tested?" Caleb asked. "With what money? We were already stretched thin. By the time we realized something was wrong, half our cattle were dead, and the bank was calling in the loan." Carlos's hands clenched into fists. "Hollister's man, that Webb pendejo, he came by, all sympathy and concern. Offered to buy the land, said he'd give us enough to start over somewhere else. But the price was robbery. Highway robbery with a smile and a handshake." "Did you keep any records? Bills of sale for the dead cattle, medical records for the children, anything?" Maria disappeared into the back room and emerged with a tin box, its contents pathetically sparse. A few papers, some receipts, a photograph of the ranch as it had been. But it was something. It was proof of loss, if not proof of crime. They spent 3 days riding to scattered homesteads and town addresses, collecting stories that all had the same shape: disaster, debt, and Hollister waiting with open arms and closed fists. The Pritchards, whose prize stallion had broken its leg under mysterious circumstances. The O'Connells, whose land deed had been challenged by a suddenly discovered prior claim that evaporated the moment they sold to Hollister. The Swansons, the Kilpatricks, the Reeves family, each with their own variation on the same theme. By the end of the 3rd day, they had 12 families willing to speak up, 23 pages of handwritten testimony, and a stack of documents that, taken together, painted a picture of systematic land theft operating under the cover of legal foreclosure. "It's good," Caleb said as they rode back toward the ranch, saddlebags heavy with evidence. "It's enough to make noise with. But we need someone to present it, someone who can't be ignored or intimidated." "There's a territorial representative," Evelyn said. "Frederick Morrison. He's based in Guthrie, makes circuit rounds to the smaller towns. Thomas met him once, said he seemed honest." "Honest is good. Competent is better. What do we know about him?" "Not much, but Mrs. Patterson mentioned he's due in town next week for the quarterly land court session. If we could get to him, present the case before Hollister knows what we're doing. That's a big if. Hollister's got eyes everywhere. The moment Morrison arrives, someone will be watching to see who approaches him." "Then we need a distraction," Evelyn said, an idea forming. "Something that keeps Hollister's attention elsewhere while we make contact." "What kind of distraction?" She smiled grimly. "The kind that makes him think he's already won." The plan came together over the next 2 days. Evelyn would go to the bank, make a public show of trying to negotiate with Hollister, beg for an extension on the foreclosure deadline. It would be humiliating, exactly the kind of capitulation Hollister would expect from a desperate widow. While she was there, keeping him occupied and feeling triumphant, Caleb would approach Morrison with the evidence. "I don't like it," Caleb said as they finalized the details. "Put you right in the lion's den." "The lion already knows where I live. This just gives him something to focus on besides what we're really doing. If something goes wrong, then you get the evidence to Morrison anyway. Don't wait for me. Don't try to rescue me. The case is more important than any one person." "Evelyn, I mean it, Caleb. Promise me." He looked at her for a long moment, jaw tight, then nodded reluctantly. "I promise. But I don't have to like it." The night before they were scheduled to execute the plan, Evelyn lay awake listening to her children's breathing from the next room. Mia snored softly, a sound that used to annoy her but now felt precious. Lucas occasionally mumbled in his sleep, fragments of dreams she couldn't interpret. She thought about Thomas, about the last conversation they'd had before he'd ridden off to gather evidence against Hollister. He'd been excited, certain that exposing the truth would change everything. She'd been skeptical but supportive, had kissed him goodbye without knowing it was goodbye, had waved from the porch as he disappeared down the trail toward a fate she still couldn't think about, without something cold and terrible settling in her chest. Was she making the same mistake? Charging forward with righteous certainty while ignoring the reality that power didn't yield to truth, it yielded to greater power? Thomas had thought evidence and justice would be enough. Thomas had been wrong, and it had cost him everything. But what was the alternative? 6 weeks until foreclosure, 6 weeks until Hollister took the ranch, took the home, took the last tangible proof that the Carter family had existed and mattered. 6 weeks until her children learned that the world belonged to whoever was willing to be cruel enough to take it. She couldn't accept that. Wouldn't. Morning came too fast and too slow, the way significant days always did. Evelyn dressed carefully, her best dress, though best was relative when you'd sold everything of value. She braided her hair with steady hands, looked at herself in the cracked mirror Thomas had hung, and barely recognized the woman staring back. Thinner, harder, older than the girl who'd come to the territory full of dreams about partnership and prosperity. But stronger, maybe. Definitely more willing to fight. Caleb was already up, checking his horse's tack with the methodical care of a man who knew that small details could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. He looked up as she emerged, and something in his expression made her stop. "Whatever happens today," he said quietly, "I want you to know this matters. What you're doing matters. Win or lose, you're standing up. That counts for something." Thomas stood up. Look where it got him. Thomas stood up alone. You've got 12 families backing you, evidence that can't be dismissed, and a plan that might actually work. That's different. Is it? Or am I just leading more people into danger? Caleb walked over, stopped a respectable distance away, close enough for intimacy, but far enough to preserve propriety. Those families were already in danger. They just didn't know it yet. You gave them a choice, face it together or face it alone. That's not leading them into danger, that's giving them a fighting chance. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that what they were doing was heroic rather than reckless, strategic rather than suicidal. But belief required certainty she didn't possess. If I don't come back, you're coming back. But if I don't, promise me you'll look after Lucas and Mia. Get them to my sister in Kansas City. Don't let them stay in the territory. Don't let them try to fight this battle themselves. Just get them somewhere safe. Evelyn, promise me, Caleb. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. I promise, but you're coming back, so it won't matter. They rode into town separately, arriving an hour apart so as not to seem coordinated. Evelyn went straight to the bank while Caleb positioned himself near the land office, waiting for Morrison's arrival. The bank was oppressively formal. Dark wood, serious paintings, an atmosphere of judgment disguised as propriety. The clerk recognized Evelyn immediately, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to poorly concealed pity. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Hollister is expecting you. That stopped her. Expecting me. Yes, ma'am. If you'll follow me. She followed him through a door marked private and into an office that managed to be both ostentatious and austere. Expensive furniture, thick carpet, but no personal touches, as if the occupant wanted to demonstrate wealth without revealing anything of himself. J.T. Hollister sat behind a massive oak desk, looking exactly like what he was, a predator dressed in civilization's clothing. 50 years old, well-fed in a way that suggested he'd never missed a meal by choice, with cold eyes that calculated value the way other men calculated distance. Mrs. Carter, he said, not rising, please, sit. She sat, keeping her spine straight, her hands folded, her expression neutral. I understand you wanted to discuss your loan situation. Yes, I'm here to request an extension on the foreclosure deadline. Another 6 months, perhaps? I have plans to... Plans. Hollister smiled, and it reminded Evelyn of the way cats smiled at mice. Mrs. Carter, I've been in the banking business for 20 years. Do you know how many times I've heard about plans? Countless times. And do you know how many of those plans actually materialized? Almost none. My situation is different. Your situation is identical to every other failed rancher in the territory. You overextended yourself. The land didn't produce as expected, and now you can't meet your obligations. It's a tale as old as settlement itself. My husband, your late husband, may he rest peacefully, made poor decisions, borrowed more than he could repay, invested in improvements that didn't generate sufficient return, and left you holding a debt you have no capacity to service. Hollister leaned back in his chair. I sympathize truly, but sympathy doesn't pay debts. Money pays debts, and you have none. Evelyn forced herself to stay calm, to play the part. What if I could find investors, people willing to provide capital in exchange for partial ownership? Who would invest in a failing ranch run by a widow with no agricultural experience? Be realistic, Mrs. Carter. Then sell me more time. Please. My children. Your children would be better served by accepting reality. I'm prepared to offer you $500 for the property, well below its value, admittedly, but more than you'd get at auction. Take the money, start fresh somewhere else. It's the smart choice. $500. For 40 acres, a house, a barn, years of labor and love and loss. It was insulting, deliberately so. Hollister wanted her to refuse, wanted her to fight, wanted the satisfaction of crushing resistance. So she gave him what he wanted. I won't sell. Not for 500, not for 5,000. This is my home, Mr. Hollister, my family's home, and I'll fight to keep it with everything I have. His smile widened. Fight with what exactly? You have no money, no resources, no leverage. What you have is stubbornness, and while I admire that quality in the abstract, it won't save your ranch. We'll see about that. Yes, Hollister agreed. We will. August 15th, Mrs. Carter. That's the deadline. When you can't meet it, and you won't, I'll be forced to foreclose. The property will be auctioned. I'll be the only bidder, and your children will learn a valuable lesson about the consequences of misplaced pride. He stood, indicating the meeting was over. Evelyn rose as well, her legs steadier than she felt. One more thing, Hollister said as she reached the door. I understand you've been hiring help. A Mr. Ward, I believe. Her stomach clenched, but she kept her face neutral. A ranch requires labor. Indeed. It's just curious, isn't it, that a woman with no money to pay her debts somehow has money to pay a hired hand? Makes one wonder where those funds came from, whether perhaps you've been hiding assets, misrepresenting your financial situation. I haven't hidden anything. Of course not, but appearances matter, Mrs. Carter. The appearance of dishonesty can be as damaging as dishonesty itself. Just something to keep in mind as we approach August. Sit. It was a threat, barely veiled. Hollister was telling her that if she didn't cooperate, he'd find ways to make things worse. Would manufacture charges, create complications, turn the foreclosure into something even more devastating. She met his eyes and let him see that she understood. Let him see that she wasn't afraid, or at least that fear wouldn't stop her. Good day, Mr. Hollister. She walked out of the bank with measured steps, didn't allow herself to hurry or show weakness. It wasn't until she was around the corner, out of sight of the windows, that she leaned against a wall and let herself breathe. He knew. Not everything, maybe not about Morrison or the evidence, but he knew she was planning something. Webb must have reported back about Caleb, about the improved well, about the signs that Evelyn was fighting instead of folding, which meant they had less time than she'd thought. Hollister would be watching now, actively looking for signs of resistance, ready to crush it before it could fully form. She found Caleb an hour later at the boarding house where Morrison was staying. The territorial representative was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with the earnest face of someone who still believed government could be a force for good rather than just organized corruption. Mrs. Carter, Morrison said after Caleb had made introductions, your friend here has been telling me about some concerning patterns in the local land market. Patterns is a gentle word for it, Mr. Morrison. What's been happening is systematic theft dressed up as legal foreclosure. Those are serious accusations. I have serious evidence. She laid out the documents they'd collected, walking Morrison through each case, showing him the patterns, the suspicious timing, the irregular loan terms, the convenient disasters that seemed to strike anyone who opposed Hollister's expansion. Morrison read through everything with the careful attention of someone trained to think legally. He asked questions, made notes, occasionally frowned in ways that suggested he was seeing connections. This is compelling, he said finally, but it's circumstantial. Each individual case could be explained away as bad luck or poor judgment. Even taken together, It's not proof of criminal conspiracy. What would constitute proof? Caleb asked. Direct evidence of coordination. Communications between Hollister and whoever's causing these disasters. Financial records showing payments to arsonists or saboteurs. Witness testimony from someone on the inside willing to testify to direct knowledge of criminal activity. We don't have any of that, Evelyn admitted. The people who do that kind of work don't keep records, and they certainly don't testify against the men who employ them. Then what you have is enough to launch an investigation, but not enough to guarantee prosecution. Morrison sat back. I can bring this to the territorial marshal, request a formal inquiry. But Mrs. Carter, you need to understand, inquiries take time, months, possibly years. And during that time, your foreclosure deadline still stands. The law works slowly, and Hollister's timeline works fast. It was what she'd feared, that even when they did everything right, played by all the rules, gathered all the evidence, it still wouldn't be enough. That the system was designed to favor men like Hollister, and challenging it required resources they didn't possess. So what are you saying? She asked quietly. That we should give up? I'm saying you need to be realistic about what legal recourse can accomplish. I'll do everything in my power to investigate these claims, but I can't stop your foreclosure, can't protect you from retaliation, can't guarantee justice. Morrison's expression was sympathetic but firm. What I can do is make sure your story is heard. Make sure it's on record. Make sure that if anything happens to you or your family, there's documentation of why and who might be responsible. That's cold comfort if we're dead, Caleb said bluntly. Yes, Morrison agreed. It is, which is why I'm also going to suggest that Mrs. Carter consider taking her children somewhere safe while this investigation proceeds. There's being brave, and then there's being foolish. Right now, staying in the territory feels like the latter. Evelyn wanted to argue, wanted to insist that running was surrender, that her children needed to see her stand. But Morrison was right. This was bigger than courage, bigger than principle. This was about survival in a world where power mattered more than justice. I'll think about it, she said, which wasn't a promise but wasn't a refusal either. They left Morrison with the evidence and his promises to investigate and walked back toward where they'd tied their horses. The sun was high and brutal, turning the town into a shimmering mirage of civilization that barely disguised the violence underneath. That didn't go how I hoped, Evelyn said. It went how it had to, Caleb replied. We got the evidence to someone in authority. We put Hollister's pattern on record. Whatever happens next, at least there's documentation. Documentation doesn't stop foreclosures, doesn't protect my children. No, but it's a start. They were mounting their horses when the first shot rang out. The sound was distinct, sharp, impossible to mistake for anything other than what it was. Evelyn's horse shied violently, nearly throwing her. Caleb's hand went to his hip, to the gun he'd been carrying since that first day, and his eyes scanned the street with practiced efficiency. There! He pointed toward the roof of the general store, where a figure was visible for just a moment before ducking down. A second shot. This one closer, kicking up dirt 3 feet from where Caleb stood. Not random, then. Deliberate. Someone was shooting at them. Go! Caleb shouted. Ride! Evelyn didn't need to be told twice. She kicked her horse into motion, hearing Caleb right behind her, hearing more shots that seemed to come from multiple directions now. The street erupted into chaos, people screaming, diving for cover, horses panicking. They rode hard, bent low over their saddles, expecting any moment to feel the impact of lead in flesh. But somehow the bullets missed or were never meant to hit, just warnings, messages, reminders that Hollister's reach extended everywhere, and his patience had limits. They didn't stop until they were 3 miles out of town, their horses lathered and blowing, their own hearts hammering. Only then did Evelyn allow herself to look back, to make sure they weren't being followed. The horizon was empty except for heat, shimmer, and distance. That was a warning, she said when she could speak. Yes. He knows we're organizing, knows we met with Morrison, knows everything. Probably. So what do we do now? Caleb was quiet for a moment, his jaw working. Then he said, We go home, we prepare, and we wait to see what Hollister does next. And if what he does next is worse than warning shots, then we fight back, with everything we have, and we don't stop fighting until one of us wins. They rode the rest of the way in silence, each lost in thoughts too dark to share. The ranch appeared on the horizon like a promise or a threat, depending on your perspective. Home or trap. Sanctuary or soon-to-be graveyard. As they approached, Evelyn saw smoke. Not a lot, just a thin column rising from beyond the barn, too controlled to be a wildfire but too present to be nothing. Her blood turned to ice. "The children," she breathed. And then she was riding faster than she'd ever ridden, fear giving her strength she didn't know she possessed. She burst into the yard to find Lucas standing by the fire pit, carefully tending a small, controlled blaze, Mia beside him with a bucket of water at the ready. Both children looked up at her panicked arrival with surprise. "Mama? What's wrong?" The relief was so intense it made her dizzy. She dismounted clumsily, nearly falling, caught herself on her horse's neck. "I thought... the smoke. I thought something had happened." "We were just burning trash like you taught us," Lucas said, confused. "Old newspapers and rags? Is that wrong?" "No, sweetheart. No, you did exactly right. I just..." She couldn't finish, couldn't explain the terror that had seized her heart at the sight of smoke, the immediate assumption of disaster. Caleb had dismounted too, was checking the perimeter of the property with systematic thoroughness. He circled the barn, the house, the corral, then came back shaking his head slightly. "Everything looks clear, nothing disturbed." "Then the warning was just a warning," Evelyn said, forcing her heartbeat to slow. "For now." That night, after the children were asleep, Evelyn and Caleb sat on the porch in the dark, speaking in low voices so as not to wake Lucas and Mia. "I should take Morrison's advice," she said. "Should send the children to Kansas City, to my sister. Keep them safe while this plays out." "But you won't." "I can't. Every day I have them here is another day I get to be their mother. If I send them away, if something happens to me before this is resolved..." She trailed off. "They'd rather have a living mother than a martyred one," Caleb said quietly. I know that's true, but knowing and doing are different things." She looked at him in the darkness. "You think I'm being selfish?" "I think you're being human. I think making impossible choices is what parenthood is, and there's no right answer, just degrees of wrong you can live with." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the prairie night sounds, crickets and distant coyotes and wind moving through dry grass. The stars were bright overhead, indifferent to human drama. "When I lost my family," Caleb said suddenly, "I spent years wishing I'd made different choices, wishing I'd stayed instead of leaving, wishing I'd put them first. But the truth is, I thought I was putting them first, thought earning money was how you loved people, how you protected them. Took me a long time to understand that sometimes the loving thing and the logical thing aren't the same." What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe logic says send your kids away, but maybe love says keep them close while you still can, and maybe you're allowed to choose love, even if it's the harder path." Evelyn felt tears stinging her eyes, grateful for the darkness that hid them. "This would be easier if you told me I was wrong, if you pushed back instead of understanding." "Would it, though? Or would it just be different?" Before she could answer, light flared on the horizon, sudden, bright, unmistakable. Fire. Big fire, not a cook fire or a controlled burn, but the kind that consumed and destroyed. They both stood, staring toward town where the glow was emanating from. "That's a building," Caleb said. "Maybe more than one." And Evelyn knew, with sick certainty, exactly which building it was. Knew before the rider came galloping up an hour later with the news. Knew before she saw Johnson's devastated face in the lamplight. Knew because this was how power responded when challenged. Morrison's boarding house had burned. Burned fast and hot, and completely, with the territorial representative trapped inside, along with all the evidence they'd given him. Hollister had responded to their challenge, and his answer was fire. Morrison was dead. The boarding house was ash, and with it, every piece of evidence they'd spent days collecting, every loan document, every testimony, every scrap of proof that might have exposed Hollister's systematic theft, was gone. Robert Johnson delivered the news standing in Evelyn's yard at 2 a.m, his face illuminated by the lantern Caleb held, his voice breaking as he described how fast the fire had spread, how the stairs had collapsed before anyone could reach the second floor, How Morrison's screams had eventually gone silent. "They're saying it was an accident," Johnson said, and the bitterness in his voice could have stripped paint. Overturned lantern, faulty chimney, whatever lie makes it convenient, but we all know. Everyone in town knows. "Did anyone else die?" Evelyn asked, though the answer didn't really matter. 1 murder or 10, the message was the same. "Just Morrison. The other guests got out. Convenient, that. Almost like someone knew exactly which room to target, exactly when he'd be alone." Johnson looked at her with haunted eyes. "Mrs. Carter, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I got involved in this. My wife is terrified. We're leaving, heading back east to her family. Can't afford it, but can't afford to stay either." "I understand. Do you?" "Because I'm not sure you do. This isn't a fight you can win. Hollister just killed a territorial representative and made it look like an accident. You think he'll hesitate to do the same to a widow and her children? You need to leave, Mrs. Carter. Tonight. Right now. Before he decides to make you the next example." Johnson rode off into the darkness, and Evelyn stood in the yard feeling the walls close in. The message was clear: challenge Hollister's power and die. Organize resistance and watch it burn. Try to use the law and discover that the law was just another tool in his arsenal. "He's right," Caleb said quietly. "This changes everything." Morrison was protected by his position, by territorial authority, and Hollister still got to him. "What protection do you have?" "None," Evelyn admitted. "None at all." "Then we need to get you and the children out. I can take you to Kansas City, make sure you arrive safely. Start over somewhere Hollister's reach doesn't extend." She wanted to agree, wanted to be sensible, practical, willing to trade pride for survival. But something in her had calcified over the past weeks, some core of stubbornness that wouldn't bend no matter how much pressure was applied. "No." "Evelyn, I said no." She turned to face him. "Morrison died because of me. Because I asked him to get involved, because I thought evidence and justice would matter. I can't let that death mean nothing. Can't just run away and let Hollister win. Staying here isn't honoring Morrison's death. It's guaranteeing your own. Maybe, but at least it'll be on my terms, on my land, fighting for something that matters." Her voice hardened. "I'm tired of running, Caleb. Tired of being afraid. Tired of letting men like Hollister take whatever they want because the rest of us are too scared to stop them. If I die, fine, but I die standing. What about Lucas and Mia? They get a say in whether their mother commits suicide." The words hit like a slap. Evelyn felt anger flash through her, hot and defensive. "You think I haven't thought about that? Think I don't lie awake every night weighing their safety against everything else? But what kind of lesson am I teaching them if I show them that bullies always win, that power always triumphs, that the right thing to do is bow down and accept it? I think you're teaching them their mother loves pride more than she loves them." "That's not fair. None of this is fair." Caleb's voice rose, then dropped as he remembered the sleeping children. "None of it. Not Morrison's death, not Thomas's disappearance, not the situation you're in. But fair doesn't matter. What matters is that those 2 children in that house need their mother alive more than they need her to be a martyr." They stood in the darkness, both breathing hard, the argument hanging between them like smoke. Somewhere an owl called, hunting in the night, and the sound felt like an omen of violence to come. "I can't leave," Evelyn said finally, and her voice was tired now, empty of fight. "I physically, emotionally, spiritually cannot make myself leave this place. It's all I have left of Thomas, all that proves we mattered, all that stands between my children and complete destitution. If I walk away, Hollister wins, and I can't let him win." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, then we don't leave. But we also don't die stupidly. We prepare. We fortify. We make sure that if Hollister comes, we're ready." "Ready how? You said yourself I have no protection." "You have me. You have a ranch that can be defended if we're smart about it. You have the element of surprise because Hollister thinks you're defeated." He started pacing, his tactical mind engaged. Morrison's death was meant to end the resistance, show everyone what happens when you fight back. But what if instead of ending it, we use it as fuel? What if we make Hollister's brutality the story instead of hiding from it? "I'm not following." Newspapers. There are reporters in the big cities who'd love a story about corruption in the territories, a murdered government official, a pattern of land theft, a widow fighting back against impossible odds. That's the kind of thing that sells papers and creates political pressure. Morrison tried using official channels and died for it. So we don't use official channels. We go public, loud, make enough noise that Hollister can't silence it without making things worse for himself. Caleb stopped pacing, faced her directly. He operates in shadows because shadows are safe. We drag everything into the light and see how he handles exposure. It was a good plan, maybe even a workable plan, but it required time they didn't have and resources they didn't possess. How do we contact newspapers without leaving the ranch, without exposing ourselves to more risk? Telegraph office. We write out the story, everything we know, everything we can prove. Send it to every major paper between here and the East Coast. Even if half of them ignore it, the other half creates pressure. The telegraph operator works for Hollister. Then we find someone who doesn't. Someone with access to telegraph lines who owes Hollister nothing. Caleb thought for a moment. Railroad. The railroad companies run their own telegraph lines, use them to coordinate train movements. If we could get to the depot in the next town over, use their system. That's 40 miles, 8 hours riding at least. And we'd have to leave the children. She stopped. Heard what she was saying. Heard herself making excuses, finding reasons why every plan was impossible, every action too risky. You're right, she said quietly. We go. Tomorrow. Early. Before Hollister knows we're moving. They spent the rest of the night preparing. Caleb checked weapons. His own rifle and pistol, plus Thomas's old shotgun that Evelyn had kept hidden under her bed. Not much of an arsenal, but better than nothing. Evelyn wrote out the story, carefully documenting every case they'd collected, every suspicious fire and convenient disaster, ending with Morrison's murder and Hollister's pattern of silencing opposition. Dawn found them explaining the plan to Lucas and Mia over weak coffee and the last of the hardtack. Mrs. Patterson will watch you for the day, Evelyn said, trying to sound casual about something that felt momentous. We'll be back before dark. Where are you going? Lucas asked, his eyes too knowing for an 11-year-old. To send some messages, important messages that might help us keep the ranch. Is it dangerous? The question hung there, demanding honesty. Evelyn looked at her son and made a choice. No more lies, no more protecting him from reality he could already see. Yes, it's dangerous, but staying here and doing nothing is also dangerous. Sometimes you have to choose between different kinds of risk. Lucas nodded slowly. Like Papa chose. Yes, like Papa chose. Papa didn't come back. The words were simple, factual, devastating. Evelyn felt them hit her chest like physical blows. No, he didn't. But Caleb and I are going to be very careful, and we're going to come back. I promise you, Lucas. We're coming back. It was a promise she had no business making, but children needed promises even when adults couldn't guarantee them, especially then. They dropped the children at Mrs. Patterson's on their way out of the territory, the old widow accepting them with grim understanding and a loaded shotgun prominently displayed by her door. Then Evelyn and Caleb rode hard toward Meridian, the next town over, where railroad tracks cut through the prairie and progress arrived on iron rails twice daily. The day was already heating up, promising another scorcher. Evelyn's horse was steady beneath her, the same mare she'd ridden for 5 years, and there was comfort in that familiarity even as everything else spun into chaos. Beside her, Caleb rode with the easy competence of someone who'd spent more of his life in saddles than in chairs, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit or ambush. They didn't talk much. There was too much to say and no good way to say it, so they saved their breath for the ride and let the thunder of hoofbeats fill the silence. Meridian appeared around noon, shimmering in heat waves like a mirage that might disappear if you looked at it wrong. It was bigger than their town, maybe 300 people instead of 150, with actual brick buildings and a train depot that suggested connection to the wider world. The telegraph office was inside the depot, a small windowed room where a young man sat reading a dime novel with his feet propped on the desk. He looked up as they entered, taking in their dust-covered clothes and urgent expressions with the resignation of someone who'd seen too many desperate people pass through. Help you folks? Need to send some telegrams, Caleb said. Multiple recipients. We'll pay cash. The operator's eyes sharpened at the mention of cash. How many we talking? 10 messages, different destinations, same content. That'll run you about $8, depending on length. Caleb pulled out money. Where he'd gotten it, Evelyn didn't know, didn't ask, and laid it on the counter. We'll write it out. You send it exactly as written. No changes, no questions. The operator looked at the money, then at them, then shrugged. Your dime. Long as it's not illegal, I'll send whatever you want. Evelyn unfolded the papers she'd prepared, began copying the message onto telegraph forms in her careful handwriting. It wasn't long, telegraph rates charged by the word, so brevity was essential, but it told the story. Morrison's murder, Hollister's pattern, a widow fighting for her land and her life. She addressed it to newspapers in Kansas City, St. Louis, Chicago, Denver, anywhere that might care about territorial corruption, anywhere that might send a reporter or at least print the story. The operator read the first message, his expression changing from bored to interested to alarmed. Ma'am, this is accusing a man of murder. It's stating facts. Facts that could get someone sued, could get me sued for transmitting them. Which is why we're paying extra, Caleb said, adding $2 more to the pile. For your discretion and your courage. The operator looked at the money, then out the window toward the empty street, then back at the message. Whatever calculation he was making came down on their side. Give me an hour. I'll send them all. But after that, I never saw you. Understood? Understood. They waited in a small cafe across from the depot, drinking bad coffee and watching the telegraph office through dusty windows. Every minute felt like an hour. Every person who walked by looked like a threat. But the operator was true to his word, working steadily, and within 90 minutes he emerged and gave them a subtle nod. It was done. The story was out there, traveling on copper wires at the speed of electricity, spreading to newsrooms and editorial desks, and anywhere that might amplify a widow's desperate gamble. They were mounting their horses when Evelyn heard the train whistle, a long, mournful sound that announced arrival and departure, connection and isolation. All the contradictions of frontier life compressed into steam and steel. We should go, Caleb said. Get back before dark. But Evelyn was staring at the train as it pulled into the station, watching passengers disembark, businessmen and families, settlers and soldiers, the constant churn of humanity flowing west. And among them, she saw faces she recognized. The Mendozas, the Pritchards, the O'Connells, family after family that she'd recruited, that she'd convinced to stand up against Hollister, all boarding the train heading east, running. She dismounted and walked toward them, feeling Caleb behind her but not caring. Maria Mendoza saw her first, guilt and shame crossing her face in waves. Mrs. Carter, we were going to write, you're leaving. After what happened to Morrison, Carlos Mendoza couldn't meet her eyes. We have children, Mrs. Carter. We can't risk them for a fight we can't win. Morrison died for you, for all of us. And we're sorry about that, truly. But being sorry won't bring him back, and staying won't change anything. Hollister's too powerful. He proved that. We have to protect our families the only way we can, by leaving. One by one, the other families offered similar explanations, similar apologies, similar retreats disguised as pragmatism. And Evelyn stood there, watching her army dissolve, watching the resistance she'd built crumble like sandcastles in rising tide. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice carrying across the platform. Hollister wins if we run. He wins if we let fear make our choices. Every family that leaves makes it easier for him to do this to the next family and the next, until there's no one left willing to stand. Then you stand, Johnson said from the train car doorway. His face was haggard, aged a decade in a week. You stand and die if that's what your conscience demands. But don't ask us to die with you. Don't ask us to sacrifice our children for your principle. The train whistle blew again. Final boarding, last chance. The families climbed aboard, taking their stories and their fear with them, leaving Evelyn standing alone on the platform with nothing but fury and grief for company. Caleb's hand touched her shoulder. We should go. They rode back in silence, the afternoon sun beating down like judgment. The telegrams had been sent, but what good were stories without witnesses? What good was exposure without people willing to testify? She'd gambled everything on organizing resistance, and that resistance had collapsed the moment Hollister showed his teeth. The ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent, looking smaller somehow, more vulnerable. They collected the children from Mrs. Patterson, Lucas and Mia chattering about their day, oblivious to the defeat weighing on their mother, and rode the last mile home. It wasn't until they were putting the horses away that Evelyn noticed something wrong. The barn door was open when she'd closed it that morning. Small thing, maybe nothing, but frontier living taught you to notice small things because they often preceded large disasters. Caleb. He saw it too, his hand going to his gun as he gestured for her to stay back. He approached the barn cautiously, checking angles, minimizing exposure. Then he disappeared inside, and for several heartbeats there was nothing but silence. When he emerged, his face was grim. "You need to see this." She followed him inside, leaving the children with instructions to stay put. The barn's interior was dim after the bright sunlight, and at first she couldn't process what she was seeing. Then her eyes adjusted, and understanding hit like cold water. Every tool was gone. Every piece of equipment Thomas had carefully collected and maintained, hammers, saws, awls, the bits and pieces necessary for ranch survival, stripped away. Even the harnesses were taken, the spare tack, anything that could be sold or had value. But that wasn't the worst part. Written on the barn wall in what looked like tar or black paint, a message in letters 2 feet high, "Last chance, leave or burn." Evelyn stared at the words, feeling something inside her shift and harden. This was beyond threats now. This was personal. Hollister wasn't just trying to take her land, he was trying to break her spirit, humiliate her, make an example that would echo through the territory for years. "When?" she asked. "Had to be while we were gone. They watched us leave, waited long enough to be sure we weren't coming back, then did this." Caleb's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Professional job. Fast, thorough, sending a message. The message being that nowhere is safe, that even my own barn can be violated." "Yes." She walked to the wall, reached out and touched the paint, still slightly tacky, confirming it was fresh. The words seemed to pulse in the dimness like a living threat. "He wants me afraid," she said quietly. "Wants me to spend tonight lying awake thinking about fire, about what he could do if he really wanted to hurt us. He's counting on fear to do what force hasn't, make me surrender." "Is it working?" She turned to look at Caleb, this stranger who'd become something more than stranger, but less than family, this man who'd stayed when everyone else ran. "No," she said. "It's doing the opposite." That night, after the children were asleep, Lucas in his room, Mia in hers, both blissfully unaware of the message painted in their barn, Evelyn and Caleb sat at the kitchen table and planned for war. "They'll come for the house next," Caleb said, sketching rough diagrams on paper. "Fire is his weapon of choice. Easy to arrange, hard to prove, effective for sending messages. We need to make the house defensible against arson." "How do you defend against fire?" "Water, lots of it. We fill every container we have, position them strategically. Wet down the walls before nightfall, keep watch in shifts. If they come with torches, we're ready. And if they come with guns instead, then we shoot back." He looked at her steadily. "I need to know right now. Can you kill a man if it comes to that? If someone's attacking your home, threatening your children, can you pull a trigger?" Evelyn thought about Thomas, about Morrison, about 18 months of slowly losing everything while men like Hollister took and took and took. Thought about Lucas and Mia sleeping in the next room, trusting their mother to keep them safe. "Yes," she said, "I can kill to protect what's mine." "Good, because I think it's going to come to that." They spent the next 2 days fortifying. Every bucket, pot, barrel, and container that could hold water was filled and positioned around the house's perimeter. They cleared brush that could catch fire easily, wet down the walls each evening, took turns on watch through the night. Caleb also taught her to shoot properly. Not just point and hope, but aim, breathe, squeeze. Thomas had taught her the basics years ago, but Caleb's instruction was different, tactical rather than theoretical. "You're not shooting at targets," he said as she practiced on old cans. "You're shooting at center mass on a human being who wants you dead. That's different. Changes the calculation. How many men have you killed? The question came out before she could stop it. He was quiet for a moment. Enough to know what it costs. Enough to know it's not something you forget or get past. But also enough to know that sometimes it's necessary, and living with the memory is better than dying with clean hands. The children sensed the tension, asked questions Evelyn deflected with half-truths and reassurances. But Lucas especially seemed to understand more than she wanted him to, would catch her looking toward the road and know she was watching for threats. "Are the bad men coming, Mama?" he asked on the third night, his voice small in the darkness of her room where he'd climbed into bed beside her. Too old for such things, but young enough to need the comfort. "I don't know, baby. Maybe. But if they do, we're ready." "I'm scared." "Me too." She pulled him close, breathed in the little boy smell of his hair. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing the right thing anyway. Is staying here the right thing? It was the question she'd been avoiding, the one that haunted her in the watches of the night when doubt crept in like smoke under a door. "I think so," she said honestly, "but I'm not sure." And that's the hardest part, not knowing if you're being brave or just stubborn, if you're protecting what matters or destroying it through pride. Papa used to say that sometimes you have to stand even when standing is hard. Did he? Yeah. When I asked him why we stayed when the ranch was failing, why we didn't go somewhere easier, he said the easy path and the right path aren't always the same. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes, felt Thomas's presence in the room like a ghost or a memory, or the echo of who they'd been when hope was still possible. "Your father was a good man," she whispered, "and he was right. Sometimes standing is all you have left." Lucas fell asleep in her arms, and she lay there listening to his breathing, listening to Caleb's quiet footsteps outside as he made his rounds, listening to the prairie night and wondering what it would bring. The attack came on the fourth night, not fire, as they'd expected, but something worse. Evelyn was on watch, sitting on the porch with Thomas's shotgun across her lap, when she heard the sound. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving fast. "Caleb!" Her voice was sharp, urgent. He emerged from the barn where he'd been sleeping, rifle in hand, instantly alert. They positioned themselves defensively, Evelyn behind the porch railing, Caleb at the corner of the house, both ready for whatever was coming. The riders burst into the yard, 5 men, faces covered with bandanas, torches burning bright. But they didn't throw the torches. Instead, they threw something else, objects that thudded against the house walls and rolled across the yard. Rocks. They were throwing rocks, like children in a schoolyard game. Except these rocks had papers wrapped around them, held in place with twine. The riders circled once, twice, throwing more rocks, more paper-wrapped messages, their horses' hooves tearing up the yard that Evelyn had tried so hard to maintain. Then, as quickly as they'd come, they were gone, disappeared into the darkness like demons returning to hell. Caleb approached one of the rocks cautiously, as if it might explode. He unwrapped the paper, held it up to the lamplight. His face went very still. "What is it?" He handed it to her without speaking. The paper was a drawing, crude but effective. It showed a woman and 2 children, clearly meant to be Evelyn, Lucas, and Mia. And around them, flames. Detailed flames consuming everything, while stick-figure men watched from the edges. Words at the bottom. August 15th, leave or join your husband. Evelyn gathered the other papers, all identical, all carrying the same message, the same threat. Not subtle anymore, not implied. Just pure, direct promise of murder, dressed up as warning. "He's not even pretending anymore," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Not bothering with legal fictions or deniable threats. Just straight up telling me he'll kill us if we don't leave. Evelyn, I know what you're going to say. That this proves we can't stay, that fighting is suicide, that my children deserve better. And you're right. You're completely right." She looked at the drawing, at the flames consuming her family, and felt something break inside her. Not her resolve, but her last illusion that this could end any way but badly. "But here's what I realized," she continued. "Hollister's going to kill me anyway, whether I leave or stay, whether I fight or surrender. Because I know too much, organized too many people, made too much noise. I'm a witness to his crimes, a threat to his power. The only question is whether I die running or die fighting. You don't know that. Yes, I do. And so do you. She met his eyes. Morrison was protected by position and law, and Hollister killed him without hesitation. What protection do I have? What's stopping him from following me to Kansas City, arranging an accident there once he's secured the land? Men like him don't leave loose ends. Caleb was silent because they both knew she was right. Knew that Hollister's kind of power didn't stop at territory lines, didn't respect the illusion of safety that distance might provide. So we make our stand, Evelyn said. Here, on this land, and whatever happens, at least it happens on our terms. Our terms, Caleb repeated. You keep saying that, but what are our terms? What does making a stand actually mean when we're outgunned, outmanned, and completely alone? It means we survive until August 15th. That's 2 weeks, 14 days. We protect the children, we protect the house, and we make Hollister work for what he wants. And maybe, just maybe, those telegrams we sent bring help. Federal marshals, reporters, someone who can stop him. That's a lot of maybes. It's all we have. They reinforced defenses that night, working until dawn. Caleb positioned buckets of water at every corner, created fire breaks by clearing vegetation, even rigged some crude alarms using cans and wire that would alert them if anyone approached. In the morning, exhausted and running on nerves, Evelyn made a decision. She gathered the children and told them everything, about Thomas's murder, about Hollister's threats, about the choice to stay and fight. Lucas listened with the grave attention of someone older than his years. Mia's eyes went wide, but she didn't cry, didn't protest, just climbed into her mother's lap and held tight. Can we win? Lucas asked. I don't know, sweetheart, but we can try. And sometimes trying is all that matters. If we die, we're not going to die. Evelyn said it with more certainty than she felt. But if something happens to Caleb and me, if the bad men come, you take your sister and you run. Don't try to fight. Don't try to be heroes. You run to Mrs. Patterson's, you tell her what happened, and you let the adults handle it. Understand? Yes, Mama. The days that followed had a strange, suspended quality. Half preparation, half waiting, all tension. They practiced evacuation drills, teaching the children the fastest route to safety. They rationed food, knowing that siege was a possibility. They slept in shifts, always someone awake, always someone watching. Caleb spent hours checking sight lines, angles of approach, every tactical detail that might make the difference between survival and death. Evelyn watched him work and realized she'd stopped thinking of him as a hired hand or even a helper. He'd become something else, partner, protector, the kind of presence that made impossible situations feel merely difficult. When this is over, she said one evening as they shared watch, assuming we survive, what will you do? Haven't thought that far ahead. Liar. Everyone thinks that far ahead. What will you do? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, maybe stay. If you'll have me. Not as hired help, but as... He trailed off, seeming unsure how to finish. As what? As someone who's tired of drifting. Someone who'd like to build something instead of just fixing temporary problems. He looked at her. As someone who cares about what happens to you and Lucas and Mia and wants to be around to see it happen. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. That's a big commitment for a man who came here to pay a debt. Maybe the debt's paid. Maybe I'm staying for different reasons now. What reasons? You really need me to say it? She looked at him in the lamplight, this scarred, competent, unexpectedly gentle man who'd appeared when she needed him most and stayed when everyone else ran. And she realized with sudden clarity that somewhere between the well pump and the fence posts and the burning boarding house, something had shifted. Need had become want. Alliance had become something deeper. Yes, she said softly, I really need you to say it. But before Caleb could respond, before words could make real what they both felt, the sound came, distant but unmistakable. Hoofbeats. Many of them. Coming fast from the direction of town. They both stood, weapons ready, hearts hammering. This was it. The moment they'd been preparing for, dreading, anticipating. Hollister was coming, and he wasn't bothering with warnings anymore. The riders appeared on the horizon, a dozen at least, maybe more, silhouetted against the dying light like a vision of apocalypse. They came in formation, disciplined, armed, and Evelyn knew with sick certainty that this wasn't intimidation. This was execution. "Get the children," Caleb said urgently. "Get them to the hiding place we prepared. Now." But Evelyn was already moving, already scooping up Mia, already pushing Lucas toward the root cellar where they'd created a concealed space behind the shelves. It's safe as anywhere could be safe, which wasn't very. "Stay quiet," she told them. "No matter what you hear, stay quiet and stay hidden. Caleb and I will handle this." "Mama, I love you, both of you, more than anything. Remember that." She sealed them in, her hands shaking, her heart breaking, knowing this might be the last time she saw their faces. When she emerged, Caleb was positioned behind the water trough, rifle trained on the approaching riders. She took her place beside him, shotgun ready, and together they waited for the end of the world to arrive in the form of J.T. Hollister's private army. But as the riders got closer, as details emerged from the gathering darkness, Evelyn saw something that made no sense. The lead rider wasn't Webb or any of Hollister's known men. The lead rider wore a badge that caught the lamplight and threw it back like a promise. Federal Marshal. And behind him, more badges, more men in official capacity, and bringing up the rear, reporters with notebooks and cameras documenting everything. The cavalry had arrived. The telegrams had worked. Help had come, impossibly, miraculously, just in time. Evelyn felt her legs go weak, felt Caleb's hand steady her, felt the weight of 2 weeks' terror suddenly lift like fog burning off in morning sun. They'd survived. Against all odds, against every expectation, they'd held out long enough for help to arrive. The war wasn't over, but this battle, at least, was won. The lead marshal dismounted with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent more time in saddles than in beds, his badge catching lamplight as he approached with his hand raised in a gesture of peace. He was older than Evelyn expected, maybe 55, with iron gray hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen enough of humanity's darkness to no longer be surprised by it. "Mrs. Evelyn Carter?" His voice carried authority, without arrogance. "Yes." She lowered the shotgun but didn't set it aside. Trust had to be earned, even from men with badges. "I'm Marshal James Hawthorne, out of the federal office in Guthrie. These are my deputies, and the gentlemen with the notebooks are reporters from Kansas City and St. Louis papers." He gestured toward the group behind him. "We received some very interesting telegrams about territorial corruption, land fraud, and the murder of a government official. Thought we should investigate before things got any worse." "You're about 2 weeks late," Evelyn said, and heard the bitterness in her own voice. "Morrison's already dead. My husband's been gone for 18 months, and J.T. Hollister's been stealing land with impunity for 3 years. "Yes, ma'am, I'm aware, which is why I brought backup and documentation specialists." Hawthorne's expression was grim. "Your telegrams weren't the only ones we received. Turns out Morrison sent his own messages before he died, copies of the evidence you'd given him, reports of threatened violence, concerns about local corruption. Between your testimony and his documentation, we've got enough to launch a formal investigation into Hollister's operations." Investigation. The word tasted like ash in Evelyn's mouth. Morrison died during an investigation. What makes you think this will be any different? Because Morrison was alone, operating in hostile territory with limited backup. "I've got 20 federal deputies, jurisdiction that supersedes local authority, and enough political pressure from those newspaper stories to ensure this doesn't get buried quietly." He paused. "And because I'm not leaving until Hollister's either cleared or arrested, those are the only 2 outcomes on the table." Caleb stepped forward, his rifle still held at ready. "You say you have jurisdiction. Does Hollister know you're here?" "Not yet. We came in quiet, camped outside town, planned our approach carefully, but he'll know soon enough. Can't hide a force this size for long." Hawthorne looked toward the house, taking in the defensive preparations, the water barrels positioned at corners, the cleared fire breaks. "Looks like you were expecting trouble." "Trouble's been threatening for days. We were preparing to either survive it or die fighting it." Evelyn's voice was steady, despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. My children are hidden in a root cellar because I didn't know if you were salvation or execution riding toward us. Something passed across Hawthorne's face. Respect, maybe, or recognition of what it cost to stand ground when every instinct screamed to run. Can you get them? I'd like to speak with all of you, understand exactly what's been happening here. Evelyn retrieved Lucas and Mia from their hiding place, their faces pale but composed. Their trust in their mother absolute, even when that trust meant crouching in darkness while armed men approached. They emerged blinking into lamplight, taking in the badges and official presence with the wide-eyed uncertainty of children who'd learned that authority didn't always mean safety. They gathered around the kitchen table, too many people for the small space, but no one suggested moving outside where conversations could be overheard or targets could be acquired. Evelyn told the story from the beginning, starting with Thomas's disappearance and moving through 18 months of systematic pressure, implied threats, and escalating violence. Caleb added details about the fence work, the well repair, the observation of patterns that suggested deliberate sabotage rather than natural disaster. The reporters scribbled frantically, their pencils scratching across paper like hungry insects. One of them, a younger man with ink-stained fingers and sharp eyes, kept interrupting with questions that suggested he understood the story's significance beyond simple frontier drama. So you're alleging that J.T. Hollister, one of the territory's most prominent businessmen, has been systematically murdering and defrauding settlers to acquire their land? The reporter's tone was neutral, but his excitement was barely contained. And you have documentation to support this? Had documentation, Evelyn corrected. It burned with Morrison. But the families who gave testimony are still alive, most of them anyway, the ones who didn't run after Morrison's death. We've already located several of those families, Hawthorne interjected. Tracked them down in Kansas City, interviewed them separately, corroborated the patterns Mrs. Carter described. Add that to Morrison's pre-death reports, and we've got enough circumstantial evidence to justify a formal investigation into Hollister's business practices. Circumstantial doesn't put men in prison, Caleb said quietly. No, but it puts pressure on their operations, creates opportunities for mistakes, encourages people with direct knowledge to come forward. Hawthorne leaned back in his chair. Here's what happens next. Tomorrow morning, I serve Hollister with notice that his bank operations are under federal investigation. All foreclosures are suspended pending review, all land transfers frozen, all business activities subject to oversight. We audit his books, interview his associates, trace the money trail, and we see what shakes loose when a man who's operated in shadows suddenly finds himself in daylight. He'll fight back, Evelyn said. He's killed to protect his empire. He won't just surrender because a marshal asks nicely. I'm counting on him fighting back. Men make mistakes when they panic, reveal connections they'd rather keep hidden, throw allies under wagons to save themselves. Hollister's power depends on fear and secrecy. We break both, and his whole operation starts crumbling. It was a good plan, maybe even a workable plan, but Evelyn had spent too long living in the gap between theory and reality to trust promises from men with badges, no matter how sincere they seemed. What about protection? She asked. When Hollister realizes what's happening, when he understands he's being investigated, what stops him from burning this ranch to the ground out of spite? What stops him from killing me and my children before your investigation can touch him? I do. Hawthorne's voice was flat, final. 2 of my deputies will be stationed here, full-time, until this is resolved. Anyone approaches this property with hostile intent, they'll answer to federal authority. And if Hollister's foolish enough to test that authority, he'll find himself facing charges that make land fraud look like jaywalking. Evelyn wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that after weeks of terror and isolation, help had finally arrived in meaningful form. But trust was a luxury she'd lost somewhere between Thomas's disappearance and Morrison's murder. I'll believe it when I see Hollister in handcuffs, she said. Fair enough. Hawthorne stood, his deputies rising with him. My men will position themselves outside. You folks get some rest. Actual rest, not just watch shifts. Tomorrow we take the fight to Hollister, and I want witnesses who can testify without collapsing from exhaustion. The reporters wanted more interviews, more details, more of the human interest angle that would sell papers and create political pressure. But Hawthorne shooed them away with the authority of a man who understood that story could wait for morning, That what these people needed wasn't more questions, but space to process the fact that maybe, possibly, they might actually survive this. After everyone had left, after the deputies had positioned themselves strategically around the property, after the children had been coaxed back to their beds with promises that the bad men couldn't hurt them now, Evelyn and Caleb found themselves alone on the porch in the darkness, too wired to sleep despite the exhaustion pulling at them. "Do you believe him?" she asked. "Hawthorne, do you believe he can actually stop Hollister?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I believe he'll try. Whether trying is enough." He shrugged. Men like Hollister don't build empires without contingency plans, without ways to protect themselves, even when the walls start closing in. So no, I don't think this ends with a simple arrest and trial. I think it gets messier before it gets cleaner. That's what I thought too. But, Caleb continued, I also think we've got better odds now than we did 3 hours ago. Federal backing, press attention, protection for you and the kids, that changes the equation. Doesn't guarantee victory, but gives us a fighting chance we didn't have before. They sat in silence, listening to the night sounds and the quiet footsteps of deputies on patrol. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and was answered by another, their voices carrying across the prairie like promises or warnings depending on your perspective. "Earlier," Evelyn said, "before the marshals arrived, you were going to say something about reasons for staying." She felt rather than saw Caleb's smile in the darkness. "Was I?" "Don't deflect. I asked you to say it, and then the world interrupted. But I'm still asking." He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I stay because somewhere between fixing your well pump and fortifying your barn, I stopped thinking about debt and started thinking about home. Because when I look at you, I see someone who refused to break even when breaking would have been easier, and that's rare enough to be worth holding on to. Because Lucas needs a man who can teach him to be strong without being cruel, and Mia needs someone who will make her feel safe without making her feel small. And because you—" He stopped, started again. "Because you make me want to stop running from what I lost and start building toward what I might find." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes, felt something in her chest that had been locked tight for 18 months begin to loosen. "That's not paying a debt forward. That's asking for something entirely different." "I know. That's asking for a future when we don't even know if we have a present." "I know that too." "And you're still asking?" "I'm still asking." She turned to look at him, the stranger who'd become necessary, this man who'd stood beside her when everyone else ran. In the lamplight from the house, his face was half shadow and half illumination, scarred and honest and waiting for an answer he had no right to expect. "Ask me again when Hollister's arrested," she said quietly. "Ask me when my children are safe and my land is secure, and I have the luxury of thinking beyond simple survival. Ask me then, and I'll give you a better answer than I can give now." "That's not a no." "No, it's not a no." He nodded, accepting the partial promise, understanding that some decisions couldn't be made under duress. They sat together until the sky began to lighten with the first suggestion of dawn, neither speaking, both taking comfort in presence that asked nothing and offered everything. Morning came with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the territory beautiful in the moments between brutal heat and brutal cold. Evelyn woke from a sleep she didn't remember falling into, found herself on the porch, with a blanket someone, Caleb, obviously, had draped over her shoulders. The children were already awake, being fed breakfast by one of the deputies who'd apparently taken on cooking duties with the same efficiency he brought to standing watch. Lucas and Mia seemed almost normal, laughing at something the deputy said, temporarily freed from the fear that had shadowed them for weeks. Hawthorne arrived as Evelyn was finishing her coffee, his face set with the grim determination of a man about to do something unpleasant but necessary. "We're moving on Hollister this morning," he announced, serving notice, beginning the investigation, making it clear that federal authority supersedes whatever local arrangements he's made. "I'd like you there, Mrs. Carter. You and Mr. Ward both. Show Hollister that the people he tried to intimidate aren't intimidated anymore." "Is that wise, putting targets in front of him?" "You're already targets. At least this way, you're targets surrounded by federal deputies and newspaper reporters. Safest you're likely to be until this is resolved." They left the children with two deputies who'd been given explicit orders about security, then rode into town as part of Hawthorne's small army. The reporters came too, their cameras and notebooks ready to document whatever happened next. Town was just stirring when they arrived, shopkeepers opening doors, early risers heading to work. The sight of federal marshals riding in formation down Main Street brought people to windows and doorways, faces curious and nervous in equal measure. They stopped in front of Hollister's bank, that white-painted monument to false respectability. Hawthorne dismounted, gestured for Evelyn and Caleb to follow, and walked through the front door with the confidence of a man who knew the law was on his side. The clerk who'd shown Evelyn to Hollister's office looked up, his face going pale as he took in the badges and official presents. "Gentlemen, ma'am, I'm not sure." "We're here to see J.T. Hollister," Hawthorne interrupted. "Federal business, non-negotiable." The clerk practically ran to the back office, and moments later Hollister emerged, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes calculating rapidly behind the facade of courtesy. "Marshal Hawthorne, this is unexpected. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "No pleasure involved, Mr. Hollister. I'm here to inform you that your banking operations, land acquisitions, and business practices are now under federal investigation. All foreclosure proceedings are suspended, all property transfers frozen, and your books are subject to immediate audit." He handed over an official-looking document. "That's the warrant, signed by the territorial governor, and countersigned by the federal district court." Hollister took the document, read it with the careful attention of a man looking for loopholes. When he looked up, his expression was still controlled, but there was steel underneath. "This is highly irregular. On what grounds?" "On grounds of suspected fraud, intimidation, possible conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Territorial Representative Frederick Morrison. Multiple complainants, corroborating testimony, and enough circumstantial evidence to justify a full investigation into your operations over the past 5 years." "This is outrageous. I run a legitimate business. Then you'll have no problem with the audit." Hawthorne's voice was mild, but his eyes were hard. "Innocent men welcome scrutiny. Guilty men lawyer up and try to run. Which are you, Mr. Hollister?" For just a moment, the mask slipped. Evelyn saw rage flash across Hollister's face, pure and undiluted, the expression of a man who'd never been challenged and didn't know how to handle it. Then the control returned, professional and cold. "I'll be contacting my attorneys, of course. This witch hunt won't stand up to legal scrutiny." "That's your right. But until the investigation concludes, all foreclosures are on hold, including—" Hawthorne pulled out another document. "The Carter Ranch. August 15th deadline is suspended indefinitely. Mrs. Vogt. Carter retains possession of her property, pending resolution of the broader investigation." Hollister's eyes cut to Evelyn, standing behind Hawthorne's shoulder, and she saw murder in them. Not legal murder, not the kind you could dress up as foreclosure or unfortunate accident, just pure, simple desire to see her dead for the crime of fighting back. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice dripping false courtesy, "I see you've been making friends in high places. How fortunate for you." "I've been telling the truth about your crimes," Evelyn replied, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. "That's not making friends. That's seeking justice." "Justice," Hollister smiled, and it was terrible. "Careful with that word, Mrs. Carter. It has a way of turning on people who invoke it carelessly. Justice for your husband, for instance. I wonder what that might reveal about his business practices, his debts, his associations." "Are you threatening to slander a dead man?" Caleb's voice was quiet but dangerous. "I'm simply noting that investigations can go in unexpected directions, that scrutiny applied to one party often reveals uncomfortable truths about others. Mrs. Carter wants her husband's death investigated? Fine, but she might not like what that investigation uncovers." "That sounds very much like a threat, Mr. Hollister," Hawthorne interjected. "The kind of threat that witnesses will remember if anything unfortunate happens to Mrs. Carter or her family." "Not a threat, Marshal, simply an observation about the nature of truth and consequences." Hollister set the warrant down on the counter with deliberate care. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have attorneys to contact and a business to protect from this harassment." They left him there, surrounded by his expensive furniture and his carefully maintained facade of legitimacy. Outside, the reporters swarmed, asking questions, taking notes, creating the kind of public record that made quiet murder more difficult. He's not going to accept this, Evelyn said to Hawthorne as they walked back toward their horses. He's going to fight, and his fighting will be dangerous. Let him fight. Every action he takes now is documented, witnessed, part of the public record. He operates best in shadows. We've dragged him into daylight. That's already a victory, even if it doesn't feel like one yet. They spent the rest of the day giving formal statements, being interviewed by reporters, building the case that would either free Evelyn from Hollister's threat or end up being her elaborate obituary. The reporters ate it up. Widow stands against corrupt businessmen, federal investigation into territorial land theft, murdered government official, and disappeared rancher. It had all the elements of a story that would sell papers and create the kind of political pressure that ended careers. By evening, exhausted and wrung out, they returned to the ranch to find everything intact, the children safe, the deputies alert. It felt almost normal, as if the nightmare of the past weeks had been just that, a dream that daylight could dispel. But Evelyn knew better, knew that Hollister was somewhere in town, plotting his response, calculating how to turn the situation to his advantage or at least minimize his losses. Men like him didn't go down quietly. 2 days later, she learned she was right. The fire started just after midnight, flames erupting with terrifying speed from the barn's interior. The deputies saw it first, raised the alarm, and everyone scrambled, grabbing buckets, forming chains, fighting the blaze with desperation and determination. But it was already too late. The barn had been doused with something accelerant, something that made the fire burn hot and fast and thoroughly. By the time they'd contained it, prevented it from spreading to the house or other structures, the barn itself was lost, collapsed into smoking rubble and ashes, taking with it the last of Thomas's tools, the harnesses Caleb had repaired, every physical remnant of the ranch's working infrastructure. "Arson," Hawthorne said, examining the scene in the growing dawn light. "Professional job. Someone bypassed our perimeter, set the charge, and got out clean." "Who else but Hollister?" Evelyn's voice was flat, dead. She'd thought the marshal's presence meant safety. Instead, it had just changed the terms of Hollister's attack. "We can't prove it was him." "Not yet. But this," Hawthorne gestured at the ruins, "this is evidence of something. Attempted intimidation, destruction of property, possibly attempted murder if the fire had spread. It gives us more ammunition for the investigation." "I don't want ammunition for an investigation," Evelyn said, hearing her voice rise. "I want my barn back. I want my home safe. I want my children to stop having nightmares about fire. When does that happen, Marshal? When do we get to stop being victims in someone's legal proceeding and just be a family again?" Hawthorne had no answer for that, and his silence was more honest than any promise would have been. The investigation ground forward with the speed of government bureaucracy, which was to say, glacially. Hollister's books were audited, revealing irregularities but nothing definitively criminal. His associates were interviewed, providing careful testimony that admitted nothing and implicated no one. Evidence was gathered, cross-referenced, documented with exhaustive thoroughness, and through it all Hollister remained free, operating his bank and his businesses under heightened scrutiny, but still operating, still powerful, still dangerous. "The problem," Hawthorne explained over dinner one evening, 2 weeks into the investigation, "is that he's insulated himself brilliantly. All the actual criminal work, the arson, the intimidation, the probable murder, was done by proxies. Webb and men like him, who are either too loyal or too scared to testify against their employer. We can prove Hollister benefited from these crimes, but proving he ordered them is nearly impossible without cooperation from the men who committed them." "So he gets away with it," Evelyn said bitterly. "Not necessarily. We keep pressure on, keep digging, wait for someone to crack. It only takes one person willing to testify, one piece of direct evidence, and the whole conspiracy falls apart. But waiting required time they might not have, patience worn thin by weeks of fear and uncertainty. Lucas was having nightmares again, waking screaming about men with torches. Mia had become clingy, refusing to let Evelyn out of her sight, her childhood confidence eroded by sustained terror. And Evelyn herself felt like she was holding on by threads, maintaining composure through sheer will, while inside she crumbled. It was Caleb who noticed it first, who pulled her aside one evening and said quietly, "You need to rest. Actually rest. Not just pretend to sleep while running scenarios in your head." "I can't. If I stop, if I let my guard down, then I'll keep guard up." That's what I'm here for. His hands were gentle on her shoulders, grounding her. Evelyn, you're no good to your children if you collapse from exhaustion. Let someone else carry the weight for a few hours. I don't know how to stop carrying it. I know, but try anyway. For them, if not for yourself. She tried. Went to bed that night and actually slept, deep and dreamless, trusting Caleb and the deputies and the marshals to keep watch. And when she woke 8 hours later, the sun was high, and the children were playing in the yard with something resembling normal childhood joy, and the world hadn't ended in her absence. Small victory. But she'd take it. The break came 3 weeks into the investigation from a source no one expected. Marcus Webb appeared at the ranch one evening, alone, unarmed, his face haggard and his eyes haunted. I need to talk to the marshal, he said to the deputy who'd intercepted him at the property line. And to Mrs. Carter. I need to make a statement. Hawthorne was summoned from town, arriving within the hour, bringing recording equipment and witness deputies. They gathered in the kitchen, Webb, Evelyn, Caleb, Hawthorne, and enough documentation specialists to ensure every word would be captured and verified. Why now? Hawthorne asked, his tone neutral but his attention absolute. Why come forward after weeks of silence? Webb's laugh was bitter. Because Hollister's cutting loose ends. 3 men who worked for him have died in the past week. Accidents, all of them. But the kind of accidents that happen when someone wants to ensure silence. I'm smart enough to see where this is heading. He'll eliminate everyone who can testify against him, then rebuild his empire on our corpses. So you're here to save yourself. I'm here to trade testimony for protection. Federal witness protection, relocation, new identity, the full package. In exchange, I'll tell you everything. Every fire we set, every family we intimidated, every order Hollister gave and how he gave it, including Thomas Carter's murder. The words landed like stones in still water. Evelyn felt the world tilt, felt 18 months of uncertainty crystallize into horrible certainty. You killed my husband. Her voice was steady, cold, dead. Webb wouldn't meet her eyes. I was there. Didn't pull the trigger myself, but I helped dispose of the body, helped cover the tracks. Hollister ordered it because Carter was gathering evidence, planning to go to the territorial authorities. We made it look like an accident, threw his horse, made it seem like he'd wandered off confused. Where is he? Evelyn's hands were clenched so tight, her nails drew blood from her palms. Where's his body? Old mine shaft about 15 miles southeast of here. Collapsed mine. Shaft goes down maybe 60 feet. We put him there. Collapsed more of the shaft on top. Figured no one would ever find him. Evelyn stood abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. She needed to move, needed to breathe, needed to process the fact that she'd finally gotten the confirmation she'd sought for 18 months, and it felt nothing like the closure she'd imagined. Caleb's hand found her elbow, steadying her, and she leaned into him without shame or hesitation. Some moments required support beyond pride. Keep talking, Hawthorne said to Webb, his voice hard. I want every detail, every crime, every piece of evidence that connects Hollister to this conspiracy. You want protection? You earn it by giving me enough to put him away for life. Webb talked for 4 hours, detailing a conspiracy that stretched back 5 years and involved dozens of crimes: arson, fraud, intimidation, 3 confirmed murders including Thomas Carter and Frederick Morrison. He provided dates, locations, names of other participants, details that could be verified and cross-referenced. And through it all, he painted a picture of J.T. Hollister as a man who'd built an empire on systematic violence and called it business. By the time Webb finished, dawn was breaking, and Hawthorne had enough evidence to arrest not just Hollister, but half his organization. We move today, the marshal said, already organizing his deputies. Before word gets out that Webb's talking, before Hollister has a chance to run or destroy evidence. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Ward, you'll want to stay here. Stay safe. This could get ugly. I'm coming, Evelyn said flatly. Thomas died because of that man. Morrison died because of him. I've earned the right to see him answer for it. Hawthorne looked like he wanted to argue, then nodded. All right, but you stay back, stay safe, and if shooting starts, you hit the ground. Understood? Understood. They rode into town at mid-morning, a force of 20 deputies plus Evelyn, Caleb, and the reporters who'd been documenting everything. The streets cleared as people saw them coming, sensed that something significant was happening, wanted to witness it, but from safe distance. Hollister was in his bank, conducting business as if the world weren't closing in around him. He looked up as Hawthorne entered, and for just a moment, his mask slipped entirely. He knew. Somehow, he knew. J.T. Hollister, Hawthorne said formally, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, arson, intimidation of witnesses, and about 15 other charges I'll detail once you're in custody. You have the right to remain silent. On whose testimony? Hollister interrupted, his voice sharp. Webb's. That coward who'd say anything to save his own neck? You think his word will stand up in court? His word, plus corroborating evidence, plus forensic examination of the crimes he detailed, plus testimony from victims like Mrs. Carter here. Hawthorne gestured to Evelyn. You built your empire in shadows, Mr. Hollister. But shadows disappear in sunlight, and we've got enough light to illuminate everything you've done. For a long moment, Hollister just stared. At Hawthorne, at the deputies with guns drawn, at Evelyn standing in the doorway, alive despite his best efforts. Then something in him seemed to collapse, the facade of respectability crumbling to reveal the violence underneath. You think you've won, he said, his voice low and vicious. You think arresting me changes anything? There are 100 men like me in the territories, 1,000 across the country. Men who understand that power is the only currency that matters, that law is just a tool for whoever's willing to use it ruthlessly. I'm not the disease, Mrs. Carter. I'm just a symptom. Maybe so, Evelyn replied, her voice steady. But symptoms can be treated, and every symptom eliminated makes the disease a little weaker. So yes, Mr. Hollister, I think arresting you changes something. Maybe not everything, but something, and I'll take that victory. Hollister was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit incongruous with the iron restraints, his face set in lines of fury and disbelief. The reporters documented every moment, their cameras capturing the image that would run in papers across the country. Prominent businessmen arrested for murder, widow vindicated, justice finally served. It felt anticlimactic somehow. 18 months of grief and fear and desperate struggle, and the resolution was just a man in handcuffs being loaded into a wagon. No dramatic shootout, no last-minute escape, just bureaucratic process applied to exceptional crime. But maybe that was enough. Maybe justice didn't need to be dramatic. It just needed to be done. The recovery of Thomas's body took another week, careful excavation of the collapsed mineshaft Webb had identified. When they finally brought him up, what remained of him, bones and tatters of clothing and a wedding ring that Evelyn had placed on his finger 7 years ago, she felt a grief that was somehow both fresh and ancient. They buried him properly this time, in the small cemetery outside town, with a headstone that bore his name and dates and the words, beloved husband and father. Lucas and Mia stood beside her, holding her hands, as the territorial minister spoke words about rest and peace and justice finally served. Caleb stood slightly apart, giving them space for family grief, but his presence was a comfort nonetheless. He'd earned his place in their lives, earned the right to share their sorrow as he'd shared their struggle. The trial took months, stretched out with lawyers and testimony and legal maneuvering. But the outcome was never really in doubt. Webb's testimony, combined with documentary evidence and forensic proof of his claims, built a case too strong to dismiss. Hollister was convicted on multiple counts, sentenced to life imprisonment, his empire dismantled, and his assets seized to compensate victims. The other families began returning once word spread that the threat was neutralized. The Johnsons came back, reclaimed their land, rebuilt with the compensation funds from Hollister's seized assets. The Mendozas returned to their ranch, cleaned their poisoned well, started over with livestock purchased using restitution money. One by one, the scattered victims of Hollister's conspiracy came home, drawn by the promise that justice had created space for rebuilding. Evelyn's foreclosure was permanently dismissed, her debt forgiven as part of the settlement, recognizing that the loan terms had been fraudulent from the start. She owned the ranch free and clear, 40 acres of hard prairie that had cost more than she could calculate, but was finally completely hers. The barn was rebuilt over the course of that fall, a community effort with neighbors contributing labor and materials, repaying debts of solidarity and shared survival. Lucas worked alongside the men, learning carpentry and cooperation, transforming from boy to young man in the process. Mia helped wherever she could, her childhood joy gradually returning as the nightmares faded. And Caleb stayed. Not as hired help, not as temporary assistance, but as something more permanent and profound. They didn't rush into formal declarations. Both had been married before. Both understood that commitment was more than words. But they built toward it steadily, the way you built anything worthwhile in the territories, with patience, persistence, and the understanding that good things took time. It was a cold November morning, the first real frost of the season sparkling on prairie grass, when Evelyn found herself standing on the porch, looking at the rebuilt barn and thinking about trajectories. How 18 months ago she'd been alone, desperate, certain that the story was ending. How a stranger on a pale horse had appeared at exactly the right moment, fixing her well pump and somehow fixing everything else in the process. Thinking deep thoughts? Caleb emerged from the barn, his breath fogging in the cold air, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that steamed like a promise. Thinking about miracles, she said. Not the religious kind, the human kind. The kind that shows up when you've given up hope and reminds you that sometimes broken things can be fixed. That a comment about well pumps or something else? Something else. She turned to look at him. This man who'd stayed when everyone else ran, who'd stood beside her through fear and fire and the slow grinding machinery of justice. Remember when you asked me something and I said to ask again when Hollister was arrested? I remember. He's not just arrested anymore. He's convicted, imprisoned, neutralized. My children are safe. My land is secure. I have the luxury now of thinking beyond survival. And? His voice was carefully neutral, but she saw hope in his eyes, tentative and precious. And I'm saying yes to whatever you were asking, to building something instead of just surviving, to having a partner instead of just a helper, to... She paused, made herself say it clearly. To you staying, permanently, as family rather than friend. Caleb set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, as if sudden movements might shatter the moment. You sure? Because that's not a decision you take back easily. That's choosing me, and all my damage, and whatever complications come with both. I'm sure. Not because you're perfect, you're not, and neither am I. But because you showed up when I needed someone and you stayed when staying was hard. Because my children trust you and I trust you, and trust seems like a good enough foundation to build on. Better than most people get, Caleb agreed. Then he smiled, genuine and unguarded, and she saw in his face the man he might have been before grief had carved its marks. The man he was becoming again through the simple act of staying put. He kissed her there on the porch, in the cold November morning with frost sparkling around them and the smell of wood smoke drifting from the chimney. It wasn't passionate or dramatic, just steady, solid, real. The kind of kiss that promised tomorrow and next week and all the seasons still to come. Lucas emerged from the house, saw them, and grinned with the satisfied expression of a child whose world was finally settling into comprehensible order. Does this mean Mr. Caleb staying forever? Looks like it, Evelyn confirmed. Good. Someone needs to help me finish the fence work, and Mama doesn't know a post hole from a pie plate. I know the difference just fine, thank you, Evelyn protested. But she was laughing, and Caleb was laughing, and even Mia, who'd wandered out to see what the commotion was about, started giggling for no reason, except that joy was contagious when you'd gone long enough without it. They stood there together, this cobbled-together family formed from loss and necessity and the stubborn refusal to surrender. A widow, 2 children, and a drifting cowboy who'd finally stopped drifting. The ranch stretched around them, no longer dying but recovering, 40 acres that had cost everything and given back just enough. The morning sun broke through the clouds, turning frost into diamonds, and Evelyn felt warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. This was what survival looked like on the other side. Not triumph exactly, not the erasure of pain or the resurrection of the dead, but the simple, profound fact of continuing, of waking up and working and building toward tomorrows that might, possibly, be better than yesterday's. Come on, she said, gathering her family with gestures and glances. We've got work to do, fences to mend, livestock to feed, a life to live. These things don't accomplish themselves. They went inside together, leaving the door open behind them because they could, because the men who'd made them live in fear were behind bars or scattered, because home was finally safe enough to be casual about. And if sometimes at night Evelyn still woke from dreams of fire, still reached out in darkness to confirm her children were breathing and her walls were standing, well, that was the price of surviving trauma. You carried the scars forever, but scars proved you'd healed enough to bear their weight. The territories were still harsh, still unforgiving, still the kind of place that broke people as often as it built them. But for one widow and her cobbled-together family, for one patch of hard prairie and 40 acres of possibility, the story had shifted from tragedy to something else. Not quite triumph, but close enough to it that the difference didn't matter. Spring would come eventually, bringing rain to break the drought and green shoots to replace the brown. Life would continue its patient work of renewal, building over the ashes of what had burned, growing despite and because of the scars. And on a ranch that had almost died but didn't, a family that had almost broken but held together, they would wake each morning and choose to continue, choose to build, choose each other. Because in the end, that was the only choice that mattered. Not whether to fight or flee, not whether to surrender or stand, but whether to believe that tomorrow could be written differently than yesterday. They believed. And in the territories, in that time, in that place where hope was a luxury and survival was currency, believing was enough. It had to be.